everybody on board that it is being recorded?
Sure, happy to do so.
Okay.
All right, meeting is now live.
Wonderful. I see we have a couple of people in the waiting room. Do you want to admit? There we go. Looks like.
Yeah, trying to get them on.
All right, the recording is going. The YouTube stream is live. So whenever you folks are ready to start, take it away.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us. My name is Dylan McDowell. I am chair of the Salem Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. So happy to be talking with you all. I know it's a challenging time tonight, given the wildfires. I know people are calling in from all over, and many of us have friends and family that are in the communities nearby. So appreciate your time tonight, and I hope everyone is staying safe. Before I do want to note just technologically that if you have a lot of video and pictures on your screen, you can click the 3 dots in any of the windows and you can hide non-video participants, and that will take away all the black boxes of people that do not have video. But I would like to call this meeting to order officially. We're admitting everyone to the waiting room. I'd like to acknowledge that this is being recorded. And this is the September 10th, 2020 meeting of the Salem Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. And let's do roll call to start. Given that we're on Zoom, I'm going to do a roll call by calling everyone's name and having you respond just for simplicity rather than us having the usual Zoom unmuting and muting conundrum. So Dylan McDowell is present. Mickey Varney.
Present.
Alan Alexander. Alan, you'll need to unmute.
Alan Alexander, I'm here.
Wonderful, thank you. Tony Cato.
I'm present.
Wonderful. Diana Dickey has notified us she'll be absent. Woody Dukes.
Present.
Dave Friedenmacher. I think we're missing Dave tonight. Keith Norris.
I'm present.
And Paul Rice.
Present.
Wonderful, thank you. And I just want to acknowledge for everyone that's attending today that Keith Norris is the newest member of the Salem Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. We're excited to have him. He comes with a background from the Wildlife Society and expertise in wildlife conservation issues. So be a great addition to the team. We have quite a night tonight. So we have 2 hearings that we're going to go through. As I mentioned, if you're just joining, this meeting is being recorded. It's also being streamed on the YouTube channel for the city. We have 3 opportunities for public comment tonight. There's going to be 1 at the start for things not relevant to the hearings, and we will have public comment associated with both of the hearings. People were asked to sign up ahead of time, so hopefully everyone that's participating was able to do that. If for any reason there were extenuating circumstances, hopefully you were able to email Tony Whitler at the city, and we can try and fit you in, but otherwise we're limiting it to the people that signed up. As I mentioned, we're going to do roll call votes today, given that we're using Zoom. And we are going to make a motion later on to adjust the hearing format slightly, just to accommodate the fact that the appellant and the applicant are different. So in the bylaws, as it's written, we want to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak and to give the neighborhood association their allotted time. And so that's just a note that I'll make for later, but we'll arrive there. And finally, just want to give a big thank you to the city staff. I know that we continue to have challenge after challenge. It's been a couple months since we've been able to meet. And I know there's been a lot of actors involved to make tonight possible in terms of preparing for this, running the Zoom, managing the comments, and then all the while, I know at least some of you are managing evacuation notices and whatnot. So thank you all for the work that you did to make this possible for tonight and that we're able to meet even though we cannot be in person downtown. With that, I would love for us to review the minutes and start right into our agenda. So if everyone could review the minutes and then when ready, someone please make a motion for us to accept. Are there any comments or addendums or edits that anyone would suggest for the minutes?
I don't have any other than my name is spelled M-I-C-K-Y instead of M-I-C-K-I, which is not a big enough deal to really make a change.
Oh, we can make that change, of course.
We should make that change. Where is that in the minutes?
It is, let me look, under 2, approval of minutes, it says Mickey seconded the minutes. Okay,
Understood. We can, I suggest that we update that to member Varney to follow the protocol and standardization of everything else.
okay.
And Rose Henlon, who's with us tonight, she's taking minutes. Rose, Mickey's name should be M-I-C-K-I for the record. Thank you.
If there's no further comments, would someone please move to adopt the minutes as amended?
I move that we adopt the minutes as amended.
Do we have a second? Second from Alan. Any discussion about the minutes? Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those, well, I suppose we'll do roll call again just to make sure we go through. So either aye or nay. Mickey?
Aye.
Alan?
Aye.
Tony?
I, however, I wasn't present at the last meeting.
Understood. Woody?
Aye.
And Keith?
I was going to abstain because I also was not a member of the last meeting. So
Fair enough. Paul Rice?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. So the minutes are approved. Now we will move into our first public comment period. As I mentioned, we are going to have public comment period associated with each of the hearings. So if you have public comment that is associated broadly with issues not related to the hearings, would be the time. And Tony Whitler, I believe you are managing that. Were there comments that we have for this period? Tony, if you're talking, we cannot hear you at this moment. You're on mute.
I'm sorry. I don't have anyone signed up for regular public comment.
Okay. Well, then we will continue on and get to, I imagine there will be plenty of discussion at our later points. So the next item on our agenda is the Climate Action Task Force. So the City of Salem is developing a climate action plan, as I think many of you have heard about. I was asked to participate on behalf of SPRAB, which I'm very excited to do. But as with all of our SPRAB activities, we like to have an alternate in case I cannot attend or for any other extenuating circumstances. And so we are looking for someone to be an alternate to serve, to be an alternate for the climate action plan for the city. Is there anyone that is interested, or are there any questions or clarifications about what that role might entail that was not already covered in the material shared?
Dylan, I'd be happy to volunteer as an alternate. I think I do think it was interesting. You know, the alternate. I assume it looked like there'd be 4 meetings over the next several months. Is the alternate also going to be attending each one of those meetings, or will they only attend the meetings that you will not be able to attend? And regardless, I'm happy to volunteer.
I believe it's the latter, that because it's a 40-person committee, that they don't want to get they don't have too many people. So I think it would be more if I was unable to attend due to prior commitments, sickness, etc.
That works.
Were there any other questions, or anyone else that was really eager to join into that as an alternate?
Well, I have a big interest in the climate, but with I think Keith brings a level of knowledge that would be useful, even though it's in an alternate way. So I'm happy to say that would agree that Keith would be a good alternate.
Well, Keith, we appreciate you jumping right in your first meeting, and you're already committing to things you don't know about. So
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
And thank you for that, Paul. I think in any case, this will be something where I plan to provide updates after each of the workshops. And I think that hopefully as a board, we can all share information, and I can then take that as the main representative, or Keith as the alternate, to be speaking on behalf of SPRAB and bringing some of our expertise from our different areas. Any further comment or anything on the regarding the climate action plan?
One question, is park staff part of their internal duties? Are they supposed to contribute to the city's climate action as far as ideas and so forth that you, independent of, our attendance?
That's a wonderful question. I think we have Patricia on. Oh, there she is.
Yeah, hi. Yes, so there will be another group that will be composed of staff as another advisory group. And so we'll be bringing ideas forward and also bouncing ideas off of the task force. So there'll be sort of different levels of input. And then all the workshops will be, the public will also be allowed to observe and have public comment on.
While we have Patricia on video, are there any other questions about the climate action plan? Hearing none, I suggest we move into our information reports, but once again, having you on video right now, Patricia, I suggest we go through, if people have any questions, we can ask them of city staff. So as we're doing what we did last time, where given the agenda that we have, information reports were sent out via email. Hopefully everyone had a chance to review those. We obviously have an opportunity now to ask questions and clarifications, but given the remote systems we're all using, you're always welcome to email staff directly, especially through Tony, and get that information back out to you. But especially while we have Patricia here, and I know Jennifer is also on the line, is there any questions or clarifications about the information provided? I had one that I'll just ask Patricia real quick. On the master planning, it seems like there's positive response overall, given the remote structure of trying to do the open houses virtually. I'm just curious how that's going from a staff perspective of getting the virtual input.
It's been a little, I'd have to say a little bit disappointing. I think people are very distracted with everything that's going on. We had a lot of input on Battle Creek Park that was pre-COVID. And so we kind of set a high bar there, I think. And since then, there's been less response. I think for Bush and Deepwood survey, we had about 351, which is okay. And, less than that for Woodmansee. So, it's a matter of getting the word out, and hopefully people on SPRAB can also help get the word out when we have a survey open, to let their networks know, so we can try to reach as many people as possible. But we're using all of our facilities, putting signs, we're doing, Twitter and radio spots, and, we're trying everything we possibly can to get people. But I think there's a lot going on in everybody's lives right now.
Understood. Yeah, and that's a good reminder, though, for all of us as we see those come through, to make sure we're sharing those links. Does anyone else have questions for Jennifer or Patricia?
I think I have a number of questions, but I think that's kind of the nature of this being the first staff reports I've read through. So I'll submit mine. A lot of them are just kind of more background related questions, and so I'll get those to folks during email. I don't want to rehash what I assume the board has a better understanding of than I do at this point. So.
Is there anything pressing at the top that you want to ask? I mean, we're happy to address it, because I wouldn't always assume we all know. I think we're all still learning. There's a lot that happens in the city.
Well, I think I had a lot of questions around the urban forestry report and the after-hour calls and kind of the background of that, and what the trends have been there, and what the cause of that is. In addition to kind of the planning for the plantings and the objectives and the process for those plans. So that had a lot of questions on that. I don't know if those are ones to address now, or if it's just if that would be better handled over at a different time, knowing we have a very full agenda.
I think some of that might be some of the plans for the planting and whatnot might be a good update for us to have at another time. So Mylan Davis is the new forester for the city. He just started, Patricia, was it February or January that he started? It was, or was it the end of last year?
I don't know. It's all been a blur.
It's all been a blur. He's relatively new. We're very happy to have Mylan. He's been doing a great job. And so unfortunately, we didn't get much time with Mylan in terms of getting to know him in person because COVID struck fairly soon after he started.
Yep.
So I think some of the questions you might have, they might be good ones for us all to address. So if you maybe want to submit your questions to Patricia, that can be part of an update next time. And ideally, the October agenda might be a little lighter and we could have a little more time to talk with Mylan about some of the tree planting. And Patricia, that might dovetail with the planning for Friends of Trees and other things as you're mapping that out for the fall.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, I also had, in reading the report, some questions about all the after-hour calls because I wasn't quite clear exactly what those entailed. I could see if a tree was down or things like that. But I would just, since it seemed to be a fairly significant issue there, you know, it'd be nice to know what some of the details are on that.
So Dylan, this is Jennifer. If I can interject.
Yes, please do.
I'll turn my video on. Oops. I mean, Mylan can certainly provide more detail, but for over the summer, just to clarify, Mylan started the very end of February is when he started with us. But a lot of those calls have to do with the extensive hot weather that we've been having. So limbs dropping and things of that nature. So a lot of the after hours calls have to do either with limbs or fallen trees that they're dealing with. But Mylan certainly can provide for you details on some of those specific cases, but that's the preponderance of it. And a lot of it has to do with the excessive heat that we've been having over the last couple months or so.
Yeah, not a lot of tree failures per se, but a lot of limb failures. Probably just a handful of fallen trees, and mostly large limbs that block the road. So we get calls after hours for anything blocking the road or right away that's a hazard. So, and we get those calls from dispatch, and usually we answer all the calls from either Salem PD or the Salem Fire Department.
Thank you, Mylan. Keith and Paul, do you have any follow-ups right now while we have Mylan on video?
Yeah, so Mylan, you said those calls are coming from Salem Fire Department or Salem PD. It's not necessarily public calls coming in after hours. The
majority of calls are from dispatch, and they'll, you know, when we go to it, there are residents who call, and we go and look at those for sure. But most of the time we respond directly to Public Works dispatch when they're letting me know that there's a police officer there and it's and there's an emergency blocking the road. We get a lot of calls from residents sometimes to dispatch where someone drives by and says there's something blocking the road, and we get there and it's not the case. So those are ones I'll go look at and inspect before I send a crew out. But you know, most of the calls, I would say, of those calls last month were legitimate calls, and yeah, like Jennifer said, that's from summer limb drop. When the heat hits, those limbs lose their turgidity and they get really brittle, and they decide to drop limbs. We've had a lot of limbs drop on cars, and no accidents. No one's been hurt, thankfully. But yeah, lots of limb drop over August and some late July.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Mylan, Patricia, Jennifer, or anyone else about the information reports provided?
Dylan, if I may, the other question I had was on some of the park operations update related to the security that's being provided by DPI. And was just curious if they provide any sort of reporting of their security activities in terms of what they're encountering from their 8 a.m. to midnight shift. we talked about that they're providing those services and kind of what the costs are around them, but in terms of the actions that they're having to take or what they're encountering during that service period.
So this is Jennifer again. So we are receiving those just started getting those reports just within the last couple of weeks. We modified their post orders. Previously, over the last several months, they had not tracked that very well. And we weren't necessarily provided that information as to what type of interactions they'd been having out in the parks. So when we extended them this most current month, we asked for that information and we included that in the post orders to update that responsibility with them. So we've just started receiving that information from them on a weekly basis.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It's an excellent question, Keith. Thanks for asking that. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, we can start moving on to the main event, so to speak. Oh, Patricia, were you about to say? Nope, I saw you went off video. Sorry, thought you were about to talk there. So now we're gonna move into our hearing. And a couple notes before we get into this. The first of which is that there was an email sent out earlier today with some sample procedures. Essentially, our bylaws, the way that they're written, have the applicant and the appellant essentially inferred to be the same individual. And so we would like to make a motion for this particular instance, just for this one, to add 10 minutes for the applicant as well as the appellant. So we have the contractor, the person proposing or doing the work versus the neighborhood association as the appellant, and wanting to make sure that everyone gets spare time to talk and ensuring that we have rebuttal time as well for both parties in this instance. There was some sample language there, but essentially we want to make these two small adjustments just for this one, not permanent changes, to make sure that it accommodates what we're dealing with today. So would somebody be open to making that motion?
I move we make that change as you stated it.
Okay, so we have a motion to allow the applicant to present evidence for no more than 10 minutes. And then this is also the rebuttal. There's also going to be time for the rebuttal, no more than 7 minutes as well at the end. Do we have a second for that motion?
Second.
Seconded by Paul. And do we have any further discussion about that motion to adjust the agenda for tonight? Okay. Let's quickly do all in favor and go through. Mickey?
Aye.
Alan? Alexander? I think Alan might have frozen, so we will come back to Alan. Hopefully he'll be able to reconnect. Tony?
Aye.
And Woody?
Aye.
Paul?
Aye.
Keith?
Aye.
And I vote aye. And Alan, we seem to have lost Alan, but we still have a majority, so the motion passes. And hopefully Alan is able to rejoin us. Tony Whitler, I'm not sure if you're able to send Alan an email to make sure, or maybe Mitch, if someone is able to reach out to him to help if he has any technical issues as we get started here.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Okay, thank you so much. So a few other notes that I would like to just say to frame the hearings here. So we have two hearings tonight. We will have a presentation from city staff, and then we'll have the subsequent presentations we just discussed. We will have time for public comment period during a specified order within the hearing procedures, but there will not be time for public comment afterwards. Only the board will be asking questions directly of staff. And this is especially during Zoom, more important than ever in terms of us trying to simplify and make sure we can all connect. It's important, hopefully everyone had a chance to review the cases closely. We will have some more information provided, but it's important for us to remember SPRAB's role is really looking at the permit and giving the permit itself. There are legal limitations on SPRAB's ability to enforce the code itself or to suggest specific redesigns that's outside of the scope of SPRAB, but our authority is within the permit and whether we affirm or deny that the permit was given on good grounds. And as we'll actually, I think I'll stop there and we can talk about other motions and everything else as we go forward. But the first hearing that we're going to have today is the appeal of tree removal on 725 Market Street Northeast. And I believe we're going to start with our city presentation.
Can everyone see me and hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay. Good evening, SPRAB board members. My name is Glenn Davis, and I'm Chief Development Engineer with the Public Works Department. I'll be doing the staff presentation regarding the appeal of tree removal permits along Cottage Street for Grant Community School. The issue before us is whether or not 5 trees in the Cottage Street right-of-way meet the criteria for removal. And those criteria are found in SRC 86.090 and Administrative Rule 109-500 2.4. So here's a vicinity map showing the Grant Community School. The school is bordered by Winter Street on the east, Market Street on the south, Cottage Street on the west, and Grant School Park on the north. The trees in question are located on Cottage Street along the west side of the school property between Market and Gaines. Here's a street view looking toward the north, abutting Grant Community School. There are 5 existing trees proposed for removal along the east side of Cottage Street in order to install a bus turnout lane being built by the school district. I'll point out that we're not here to debate the merits of the bus pullout, but only the street tree removal in order to build the bus pullout. So for background, the Salem Cottage School District submitted a proposal to construct a bus pullout along Cottage Street. That proposal was approved by the planning administrator, acknowledging that 5 street trees were proposed for removal. The site plan was appealed by the Grant Neighborhood Association. And in the midst of that process, the district obtained approval from the Public Works Director to remove the trees, conditioned upon approval of the site plan review. So City Council affirmed the site plan review, and the neighbors have filed a separate appeal of the tree removal permit, which is why we're here today. So here I'll show the proposed bus lane design on Cottage Street. For this drawing here, the school building would be at the bottom of the drawing and Market Street would be to the left. The parking area on the left side of the page in green is existing, and the bus lane is proposed to continue from that existing parking area to the north to the pedestrian crossing at Gaines. And then I'll show for comparison here at the bottom of the screen that same map with the existing conditions emphasized. So the bus lane plan removes that existing curb, pulls the bus lane back to about the existing tree line, and the parking on the right is new, and then it encroaches the curb back a little bit beyond the bus lane, and then that tree line, what used to be several feet behind the curb, the trees now conflict with that new bus pullout. So I'm an engineer, so I'm going to describe this in another way. With the so on the screen here, we have a cross-section view of the bus pullout. The top half shows the pullout without the parking, and the lower half shows the pullout with the parking. And these are looking north. So the red vertical line on the left is the existing curb line. And then on each cross-section, there's a vertical black line that shows the approximate limits of the street work. And then as you can see, the existing tree line, it's not only in the work zone, but it's also in conflict with the movement of vehicles and pedestrians. So there's really no physical way to build this bus pullout and retain the trees. So next, I will acknowledge that the Neighborhood Association discovered a few errors in the application materials and in the notice of decision. So I'll clarify a few facts to make sure there's no confusion. First, this is a new bus pullout that is an expansion of an existing parking pullout, as you saw in the drawing. Second, the on-street parking is reduced, not expanded. And third, the city's urban forester reviewed the trees and reported a variety of tree types and sizes: 2 elm, 2 Zelkova, and 1 white ash, ranging from poor to good condition, ranging from 4 to 10 inches in diameter breast height, and ranging from class 2 to class 3. So the approval criteria for tree removal can be summarized by determining whether or not there's any reasonable alternative. However, I will clarify the context of reasonable alternatives. City Council has affirmed the district's proposal to construct a bus pullout. So I'll repeat that this bus pullout design is already approved, and the district has an obligation to build the bus pullout pursuant to the council's decision. So that's not being discussed here. The question of alternatives is asking whether or not the bus pullout can be constructed without removing the trees. So staff has found that the district cannot reasonably construct the bus pullout and provide accessibility to students without removing the 5 street trees. Hence the director's approval of the permit. So staff recommends SPRAB affirm the director's decision to grant the permit and remove the 5 street trees in Cottage Street. And that concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. That was quite concise. I appreciate that. You still have a whole nother 10 minutes you could have used. So now we will move into the applicant, and there is a time for the applicant to speak if desired. I'm not sure if that was planned on or not.
Yeah, yes, it is, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Mark Shipman, members of the SPRAB. I'm a land use attorney with Sawfield Griggs, 250 Church Street Southeast, Suite 200, Salem, Oregon, 97301. Here this evening on behalf of the applicant property owner of the Salem-Keizer School District. Also here with me this evening virtually is Joel Smallwood. Joel is the Director of Maintenance and Construction Services for the district. And as Glenn identified, the question before you this evening is, should you affirm the Public Works Director's approval for our tree removal permit to remove the 5 trees along Cottage Street Northeast, fronting the Grant Community School? And I respectfully request that you move to approve staff recommendation as noted in the staff report. This request is tied to the 2018 school bond project and allows the school district to implement the necessary renovations and expansion plans for Grant Community School. These trees need to be removed in order to accommodate an on-street bus and ADA parking area for medically fragile students that will be attending Grant. The applicant has spent significant time with their engineer and architects to limit the size and design of the on-street bus and ADA parking area. This plan and design was submitted to the city and extensively reviewed by the Planning and Public Works staff and approved in SPR 20-Site Plan Review 20-19. Further, this decision was called up by City Council. They held a public hearing and ultimately approved the plan and design. The site plan review has a condition of approval as a requirement that the district replace 1 tree for every tree that they remove as a part of the design. The district is already bound by that condition of approval, and that does not change. This plan is the minimum necessary to accommodate the approved on-street bus and ADA parking area, and there's no reasonable alternative design that will allow for the retention of the existing trees with this approved design. I appreciate the exhibits that Glenn provided to you. They were pretty good. On balance, this is a good application. We satisfy the mandatory approval criteria and respectfully request that you move to approve staff recommendation as contained in the staff report. I'm happy to address any or answer any questions that you may have of the applicant at this time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we are going to go through our, we will go through and then we'll come back to questions. And let us then go through to the appellant, in this case, the Neighborhood Association.
Good evening, members of the SPRAB. My name is Sam Skiller. I'm the co-chair of the Grant Neighborhood Association. I've lived on Cottage Street for 22 years. Big fan of Grant School. My kids went there and have been involved with the Neighborhood Association for a long time. I'm not quite sure what we do here, given that the city has already approved the plan, but I will give you some background on the journey. And I have a couple of slides that I think I'll start with that if I could screen share. Tony said that would be okay.
Yeah, Mitch is going to give you the opportunity to do that.
Okay. Can you see that first slide there? Is that slide?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So this is a part of, not the entirety, but the part of our testimony that we gave at City Council. There's some things I think that are really important to understand. As neighbors, of the Grant Neighborhood Association, we're the smallest neighborhood association in the city, and Grant School also has the smallest campus of the 70 or so school district sites. So we're kind of a compact urban neighborhood, older neighborhood. We have incredible parking pressures due to state parking and neighbor and school parking. But we're very cohesive, we're very positive. We like to say that we're a yes neighborhood. We just like to get to yes together. And that's been our journey and our struggle with the district since March, is to try to get to a mutually beneficial solution. So we love Grant School. It's very important to establish that we are longtime partners, allies, and advocates. Can you hear me okay? I was picking up somebody else there. Our children are Grant Grizzlies, and we mentor students and volunteer after school. We are not adversaries. Oftentimes in something like this, when there's appeals, there's a perception that the appellant is some cranky old people that don't want to see things change or have some axe to grind with the city. That's not us. We're not adversaries, we're not critics, we're not naysayers, we're not monkey wrenchers. It was our respectful request, though, that we not lose the 5 trees in the greenway. More importantly, as stated in our original letter, it's not so much the trees in the greenway, which we think are very important, it's putting more traffic on Cottage. And I know we're not debating that anymore, but Cottage has been a mess, and it's going to be a terrible mess when school resumes because of all the traffic. For 25 years, we have proven our devotion to Grant School. Twice we've raised over $50,000, $100,000 total to build the 2 playgrounds that you see at Grant. Those are neighborhood built, not district or city built. The city worked very closely with us in the Parks Department, so thank you, SPRAB, for being a great partner on those 2 projects. Every April for Earth Day, we rally neighbors, teachers, families, and partners for the annual Grant School Beautification Project. And you can see just one of the years, we've done it for over 12 or 15 years. We do it in conjunction with Earth Day and Tree City USA. We converted a concrete courtyard into a children's learning garden with raised beds and greenhouse. We've installed pavers and paths, built composting bins, and planted most of the shrubs surrounding the school. So you can see parents, teachers, neighbors, and staff. We love our school. There's Jan, the former city arborist. He and I worked on a plan with the school to get rid of the dying hawthorn trees that were in that green space that we're looking at. And he came up with a menu of trees that would be advantageous for our urban area. And over a course of 5 years, we planted those trees. Those are the trees that are now slated to be torn down. So it's going to be a little hard to explain to the kids at Grant School, many of whom are older now, but why the trees that they planted made way for. We already have buses and parking on Winter. We already have buses and parking on Market, and now the 3rd. And Grant School only has 3 frontages, Market, Winter, and Cottage. And now all 3 streets are going to have parking and drop off for the school. This is what it currently looks like. This picture was taken within the last month, looking south on Cottage. You can see the 5 trees, Zelkova, ash, Zelkova, elm, ash, Zelkova, and elm way down at the end. This is what it would look like after the trees are gone. We do know the trees would be replanted, but they would be taller, skinnier trees so as not to leave leaves on the roof. And so we're not going to get that great cathedral effect of the trees crowning, which is what our goal was when we worked with Jan, the arborist, was to create, trees that would provide quiet, shade, slow traffic, etc. So we've worked with several mayors and several arborists now. We're on to our 2nd arborist. We love the city, we love the school, we love our neighborhood, and we love our trees. We're very disappointed that the council and district approved the plan, but we have an alternative. One of the things we were doing over the last many months was looking at alternatives, and we looked at several, and to the district's credit, they did pencil out 2 alternatives. One was over on Winter Street, which the neighborhood was most excited about. It would provide drop off for the kids on the school campus. but that plan is really expensive and takes out a lot more than the 5 trees on Cottage. So right now, the neighborhood, we have a letter that we prepared. It hasn't been sent yet, but we have a letter that has been prepared and sent to the city. I'm sorry, to the district, that will be sent to the district, affirming our support of an alternative idea that they presented to us about a week and a half ago. And I don't know if we want to get into that tonight, Joel and Mark, but it's a very interesting plan that has a lot of potential that would accommodate the buses, provide an improvement to the school building, and preserve 3 or 4 of the trees that we're talking about. So I know I still have a little bit of time here. Can I yield some of my time to the district to answer a question or to provide input?
Can you clarify what you mean? You want to ask them? And
Well, I want to know if it's okay if we divulge the idea that we have. The neighborhood's a little nervous if the appeal on the 5 trees is denied. And we have a commitment from the district, and we feel good about the commitment we have from the district, that they will not take out those 5 trees, all 5 of those trees, anytime soon, because there's still a number of hoops and hurdles they have to go through with the bond committee and with the school board on this project. We also don't know when and if those kids are ever going to, when are they going to be coming to Grant with COVID? So the compromise idea that is being talked about, but it hasn't been approved by anybody, is something the neighborhood's very excited about as an alternative to losing those 5 trees in the greenway, which we're not at all excited about.
And so your question is whether Mark is comfortable with divulging what that idea is. Is that accurate?
Correct, or Joel.
I'm open to that clarification, Mark or Joel, if either of you want to share if this is getting beyond the scope of what you'd like to talk about, or if this is something that can be presented or shared today.
Thank you, Chair McDowell. Not really prepared to go into great detail other than to agree with what Sam has said. The district has committed to fully look at an alternative Cottage Street plan. We have a lot of steps in our court to get that through. We have been waiting, not long, just a few days now, for an official response from the neighborhood association. So that plan, how we would see that coming forward would be get through the conversation with the neighborhood association. We have some internal groups that would have to approve us to even further the design to a point that we would introduce it to the city and city staff to start basically the process that got us here today on that plan. So for a site plan review. So we are, as Sam mentioned, and I want to make sure I say it publicly here, the district has committed to the neighborhood association and to other neighbors to not undertake this work immediately upon approval, to continue working through an alternative plan. And we stand firm in that commitment. However, this particular hearing is about approving the tree removal permit for the approved plan that exists. And as was mentioned earlier on in the city staff report, we simply cannot construct this bus lane as permitted, or rather as approved in site plan review. We cannot construct it with these trees here. So that's why we are here tonight.
And Joel, I appreciate you. I wasn't trying to put anyone on the spot. I think it's good to get in the record. We don't have to do the details of our idea because, as Joel said, there's still a lot to work out. But I guess I'd want SPRAB to know, just as they're sticking to everyone needs to keep all their options open. We get that. But we do want to see if, I guess we would look, even if you were to deny our appeal, that there would be some sort of acknowledgement of the good work that the district and the neighborhood are doing together, and some kind of, and if there's a better plan that preserves trees and is something that both the school and the neighborhood really like, we'd like to see that happen rather than reverting to the original plan and taking out all 5 trees. I don't know if that's within your purview. As a chair of many commissions and task forces, there's any number of ways a group could form a motion, or either a motion that you have legal standing to make, or at least a philosophical motion for, keep up the good work. We like what we hear and we look forward to seeing a good result.
I appreciate your positivity. I'm being alerted. Tom Kupani, the city attorney, would like to make a comment about that.
So this is a little bit of an unusual circumstance. One choice that, and it would require the applicant's agreement. One opportunity that you could take would be to, the applicant could withdraw their application for permit without prejudice. You could try to work out the details. There, of course, would be a land use process that would have to occur if there was a change in the plan, and then a reapplication for the permits could occur. That would be one way to handle this if the parties are still talking and are amenable to making a change. That's just simply an idea, but it's certainly not mandatory. And if the applicant wants to move forward on their permit as stated, they are certainly able to do so.
If I might ask a question of the attorney, isn't it also possible though that with the permit they have, they could make requests for amendment to accommodate the alternative in some of the decisions verbiage that was in the original city staff deal? It left that door open, that the permit as approved, the permit with amendments, or even new ideas as they may come forward from the conversations with the neighborhood.
Would the chair like me to answer that question?
Yes, please, Tom.
Certainly, they could have the permit approved and they could not act on it. As I sit here today, I can't remember what the timeline is for an approved permit if you have to reapply after a certain amount of time, but I believe there is a time limit on that. So a choice that they could make would be they have their permits in hand but decide not to exercise them. If they work out a different plan, get approval to make a change through the land use process, and then reapply for permits under the new plan.
Because one thing what the neighborhood doesn't want is for the district to have to go through a lot more hoops and hurdles. If there were intermediate steps for doing amendments and a change to an existing plan, it's not our intent or desire to force them to go through lots of hoops and hurdles again if there's some intermediate.
Well, there will be hoops and hurdles that they have to go through if they're going to change the plan that has been approved both by the Planning Commission and the City Council. And so if there's a change at this point, there is going to be some process that has to be gone through. So that would be a natural result of wanting to build something other than what has been approved by council.
Thank you.
I want to make sure we respect the opportunity for public comment in this process. And so may I suggest that we have the public comment and then continue with this discussion of board questions of staff and presenters? Any objections to that? I do know we have a couple of public comments that have been teed up, and Tony Whitler, I would ask that you could help us get those ready.
I don't have anyone registered for this case.
Oh, I misunderstood. Those are for the next case?
Yes.
Okay.
And also Dylan David Friedenmaker is in, and Alan Alexander is back up.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're happy to have you back, Alan, and David, thank you so much for joining us. I don't see Dave on video right now, but hopefully he'll be able to join us on video soon. There he is. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Sorry I was late.
We understand. It's a challenging week for many reasons. We do, so now we're moving on to the part of our procedure where we have questions of staff from the board. And I think at this point, I'd like to open it up, just given Zoom and complexity of being able to call on everyone, that we can have staff of presenters, so staff and from the appellant and the applicant as well, to try to see if that works. So I want to open up the floor to members of SPRAB for questions they might have.
Yeah, Mr. Chair. I
Yes.
think this question kind of for staff. I'm not sure which staff, but I have a question about how, and this gets a little bit more generally and kind of plays, I think, into the next hearing as well, but question about how the planning process, the city's planning process plays into the tree removal process. And part of the reason for that question, I think, Glenn, part of your presentation talked about how they cannot build this this bus pullout without this tree, without removing these trees, and therefore need the tree removal permit in order to fulfill the approved plan by the city. And I think my question there is in that instance, then isn't the city's planning process already approving the tree removal process? And what is the intent of having a separate process for approving the tree removal permit? You know, or is the city's plan kind of like our park master plans that are general intentions and guidelines around where that's headed? So if you can talk a little bit to that relationship there between those two approval processes, I guess.
Sure. I think the simplest way to put it is that this is these are fairly new regulations that, especially having SPRAB here, the tree removal permit appeals, and we are really revisiting that relationship between the land use process and this appeal process, because I think the intent, staff really thinks the intent of this was when you had a standalone tree issue, much like the Gaddies had, where there's something that really needs to be addressed at that level. We don't think it was probably the intent to have a council approve the decision that then comes to SPRAB for a secondary approval. So we're really revisiting, is there a better way to do this? So this is really exposed that kind of, we're not sure that was the intent. But for most areas of development, there's a permit process, there's a building permit process, there's a construction permit process, but those don't have appeals to an appeal body. Those are just a building permit, and there's no other steps to go through. So this is unusual that a tree removal permit would then have an appeal process. So that's kind of a unique situation that may not have been intended. So you may see changes proposed to the process here on after.
Yeah, and I guess you know, if I may, Mr. Chair, follow up on that. I think the you know, one of the criteria for removing a tree does not list implementation of a land use plan, right? It lists construction kind of generically, but I guess the idea of this permit process could totally stop a land use plan that as you said has gone through a council approved process. Like I said, there's an apparent conflict there that I am personally not sure how to work out in my mind.
It's like I said, I don't think that was the intent of the regulation, and I said that you'll likely see proposed changes to it.
And if I may clarify on what Pete was asking too, if the permit was not upheld by SPRAB, then it would then go back, then the planning process would then go back to the Land Use Commission. Is that correct, for further revisions and amendments?
There's an amendment process that the land use process could go through to rectify whatever needed to be changed, certainly.
Mickey, I believe you had a question.
Well, I was just kind of thinking, so have there been, I guess my question would be for the city, and this is probably kind of broad in a similar situation, have there been past instances where there have been modifications to site plans negating the necessity of a tree removal permit? I mean, how does that work? I mean, is there an expiration date for it, and does this occur occasionally?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Let me make sure. So it is very common in the land use process that we preserve trees. So whether street trees or whether private property trees, that's a considerable part of the land use process. And I give a number of examples of that. So and you'll hear in the next hearing that there were something like 22 trees proposed for removal, and we reduced that down to 3. And so that's all part of the land use process. So it's not absent that, but it just happens to be in the code provisions that there is a separate permit issued later for the trees, and there is an appeal process for that. So does that kind of get to the question you asked?
Yeah, I think so. I was just kind of wondering about an expiration date for a permit, because I glanced at the permit and I didn't see anything actually written on the permit. And if it doesn't take effect, I mean, if the trees don't get removed, I guess, you know, it just doesn't take effect.
Yeah, it would likely would, it's conditioned upon the site plan review approval. And the site plan review approvals have an expiration date for those. So I think the tree permit would likely expire with the site plan review expiration.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions for the, yes, Paul?
Mr. Chair, yeah, seems like last year we had, I call it a parallel process in terms of Division Street, but that was a situation where there had been no permits per se. It was still in the design stage. And it was a question of whether the design met the criteria of saving trees. So that was a little different than this one. And I will assume that in this permit process, there was a requirement to replace at least 1-for-1 with trees, you know, I guess located nearer this, you know, the area between the school and the sidewalk. So just a clarification within that permit, was there a requirement to replace 1-for-1 in terms of after tree removal?
Yes, and now just for information, I will point out that the Chapter 86 does require the trees be planted to the maximum extent feasible for development anyways. And so that's a normal criteria. And so I think the 1-for-1 was just making it a little more specific for this case.
Paul, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Woody, I see you have a question.
Yeah, and in looking at all the paperwork that went with this project, Grant, one of their concerns was that they weren't getting consideration for potential alternatives. So I'm very glad to hear the conversation that has come up here between them and the school district, that they're, you know, showing some considerations.
Mark, I have a question for you in terms of timeline, just based on what was presented. And I guess this could also be a question of someone else from the district, but just thinking about how far, if you're already looking at potential alternatives, or that conversation is being had, and when would this development likely start, or what is the timeline for that? Without, I'm sure this is in here, so I apologize, but hopefully you could help clarify the timeline for me.
Well, the timeline has changed, Chairman McDowell, because of the appeals and because of the discussions that the school district's having at a fairly high level with the Grant Neighborhood Association. So, you know, our plan was, in fact, the district's plan is to begin construction. They have begun construction on part of the elements, but not with respect to the removal of the trees, not with respect to the bus turnout and parking areas. So until that's fully vetted and hashed out, that won't happen. And practically, that's probably not going to happen until, I would guess, until spring of 21.
Thank you. Further questions? Tony, Alan, Dave. Dave, you're abstaining for this one, I believe, correct? But feel free to ask questions. I know you're abstaining from the motion itself. But.
Yes, I'll abstain. I'll recuse myself as being a part of the school district.
Understood. I want to make sure there's time for anyone else on the board that has questions for staff or for the presenters.
Mr. Chair, just one more. I'm trying to think of what my specific question is around this thought, but something I noted in this process is that the tree removal permit, we're talking about kind of the relationship with the land use planning process, and the tree removal permit, while it was applied with, upon approval of the land use plan, it was approved before the land use planning piece was approved. And it just seemed interesting to me that if I'm remembering my dates correctly on it, that the timelines were very overlapping. And I don't know if that's, being a new member of the board, I'm not sure if that's a common situation in terms of the tree removal permits and the land use planning. And as Glenn said, it's a new process. So maybe this is just kind of one of those things that we're figuring out as we go along with it. But I thought that was noteworthy, I guess.
Well, I can share real quick that the approval was conditioned upon the site plan review being approved. And so when the tree removal permit was, when the decision was granted and notice was posted, the site plan approval had been approved by the planning administrator and was appealed to council. And so there was a bit of an overlap because there's a 30-day posting period. And so there's kind of a no-win as to how to do it. And so we made sure that the trees wouldn't be removed unless the site plan review was approved. And so there was caution there.
Are there further questions from the board before we move into the final rebuttals and statements from both the applicant and the appellant? With that, let's have first, there's a chance for the appellant rather to give any rebuttal or closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. I guess I just want to clarify, I don't know that I made it clear. We are at the Neighborhoods Association and on the block that's bordered by Cottage, Gaines, Church, and Market, which is the block that would be most affected. We are very optimistic about the idea that we're working on with the district. And again, even though we're asserting our appeal here, because we're trying to, we'd love to save all 5 trees and the greenway if possible, but we understand, we're in a good position right now in our conversations with the district. I guess I'm just, wanting to make sure, and I don't think this body can do anything about it, make sure that we don't end up not having the alternative and then we're right back to where we are and we lose everything. So I guess to whatever degree SPRAB can be complementary to the process when plans do come forward, to be encouraging to city staff, because the alternative would save some of the trees and would replant trees and we think would be, it creates basically a second entrance there to Grant School that we think is a improvement for the neighborhood beyond the bus lane and in addition to preserving some of the greenway. So we are not stomping up and down demanding that you grant our appeal. We recognize that it's the case may not be that strong. We just wanted to be on record everywhere we could that, we're good neighbors. We love our neighborhood. We love our school. We work with the city. We work the city process. And for a while, it just seemed like none of our needs are going to be met. Now we're in a place where that's looking pretty darn good. And I want to go on record to credit the district for that. From the bond committee to Joel and Mike Wolf and Christy Perry, the superintendent, there's just been some really good conversations and we're very optimistic. So anything that can be done to cheerlead the coming process and make it as efficient as possible, because again, it's not our goal to create headaches for the school district. We want a mutually beneficial solution and we have one. And even though you don't know the details, we're hoping that when you find them out, you'll be supportive.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for your positivity. I appreciate that. I think now we'll have our statement by the applicant, and I would appreciate if you could comment on what Tom Capani had suggested as a possible alternative in terms of withdrawing and just I know there wasn't a chance to respond to that after he proposed it.
Thank you, Chairman McDowell. I appreciate Tom's comments. I also appreciate Sam's comments. They're good, but in the context of tonight's hearing, it kind of diverts us from the process that we started on, and that really I think the district would prefer to see further tonight, which is we've got an approved site plan by the city. We've got a recommended staff recommendation to you as SPRAB with respect to approving our request. It may end up going nowhere, and it may not happen based on continuing discussions. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to mess up the process that we've embarked on this evening. I would prefer, I appreciate Tom's comments, but I would prefer that we wrap this up. We close the hearing, you deliberate, and hopefully approve our request, and allow the district and the neighborhood association to continue the good dialogue and discussions as they've been having. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. That concludes the public portion of the hearing, and now we have the deliberation portion among the board for us to talk and decide how we may proceed. I will note that we do have the opportunity to ask clarifying questions of staff. I know Glenn is still participating as well, and we have Tom on board. Also, just want to underscore the proposition we're in. I think as some of Keith's questions brought out, that this is a somewhat unique situation that is a little bit new for what the process originally intended. The scope of SPRAB here is really about the permit and the reasonable alternatives as proposed. And so just keeping those in perspective as we make a decision and deliberate. But I want to open it up for the board to share their thoughts and concerns as we come towards a decision.
Well, yeah, we're kind of, it seems to me we're coming a little late to the show here because so much has already progressed. I'm actually familiar with that street, as I know somebody that lives in that neighborhood, but there isn't really a conflict of interest here though. Those are not mature trees. Like on the other side of the street, you had really a substantial tree canopy. So we're talking about relatively newly planted trees, none of which were any great size. It would, from my way of thinking, if we're trying to look at the intent of, tree canopy Salem, of saying the removal of those 5 trees, along with the replanting of trees, although they wouldn't be of equal size right now, it doesn't seem that there's any real, seems like we're not reducing the tree canopy just for the purpose of development. There's also the fact that, it looks like the neighborhood and the school are open to exploring some other alternatives. So, but my inclination would be to deny the appeal and let the permit stand as it exists.
And perhaps there's a motion that could be made to Paul's comments that could do what you're saying, but also encourage or applaud the continued collaboration between the two bodies that we've heard expressed today. But Keith, I see you were going to speak.
Well, I was just gonna kind of follow up on Paul's initial comment there that it feels like we were coming a little bit late to the party, right? And that gets at some of my questions of Glenn as to the where this process fits in kind of the land use planning process, because I think, for this purposes of construction, part of the permitting process is ensuring that reasonable alternatives have been explored, and I gathered that, at least in this particular instance, they were as part of the land use planning process. That just wasn't part of the tree removal permitting process. And so, I think in the materials here, there's pretty sufficient documentation that shows some back and forth between, or as part of the land use planning process, at least as I am understanding the materials. And so So I do gather that there have been a number of alternatives explored, and it sounds like they are still continuing to be explored. But I think that's where that process question comes in, is as I'm seeing it. But like Paul, I would tend toward denying the appeal and affirming the director's permit on this one.
And if I may make a suggestion for when we get to the point of a motion, to try and simplify how we could phrase it is, do we affirm the permit being issued? So a yes would be we affirm the permit, and that would deny the appeal, versus no would be we think that the permit was issued in error. But I know that it can get a little confusing with whether what we're affirming or what we're denying. And so I think a yes being that we're affirming the permit may be a more simplistic way for us to talk about this as we're discussing. Other board members, comments that you'd like to make? Alan, you're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Yeah, I think I'm off now. I'm somewhat of the same mind, but I'm concerned about the factual errors that were included in the tree removal application. I just find it difficult for professionals to have those kind of errors, that were pointed out by some of the people who found the appeal. Now, I think there's a strong case to support this, because I think it's probably necessary, and I think that the cost versus the benefit is to deny it, I think would probably work against the betterment of the neighborhood and the school. But I'm just upset that we find factual errors that should not be in an application. So that's sort of how I feel.
I think that's very valid. And I guess, Glenn, is there any comment you'd like to make in terms of staff, just in terms of the frequency of errors like that, and putting those in context of other applications you receive on a regular basis?
I will say that I don't know that I would have agreed that each one was an error. There was some confusion, I'll say, some maybe language that could have been written better for clarity in hindsight. But yeah, the application we received at the city had given a tree type, and that got forwarded. So yeah, there was a variety of different issues. Each one individually, you could go through and explain what happened. We do our best to try to address those things, and we own up to it if we made a mistake. So I hope that improves.
Well, I don't think the mistake was on your staff's part. I think it was in the original, in the application. In fact, the staff report points out where there were deficiencies in the application. So they were identified by your staff.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Any last comments before we make a motion, or if anyone is comfortable making a motion, then we can have that be the discussion piece. I would just add from my own perspective, I really appreciate the positivity coming into this, just that both parties seem to be very good in good faith and good natured about partnership. Procedurally, it does seem like we are in a place where there are some mixed up timelines, and in terms of the reasonable alternatives, I do feel that many of them were explored, and that in terms of the narrow vision that we have to take as SPRAB on this issue, that I seem to concur with what Paul, Alan, and Keith were saying, that I believe we're in that we should most likely affirm the decision. That being said, I do think that we should either on record or just as part of this, just the minutes or our own expressions, encourage that continued dialogue and collaboration between the neighborhood association and the school district as they continue to pursue other opportunities.
That almost sounds like a motion, Dylan.
I know it's always better if someone aside from the chair makes the motion, so I'd open it up for you.
No, I'm not sure I can be quite as literate, but I make a motion that we allow the permit as issued to stand but we encourage the parties involved to continue their dialogue if they can come up, to see if they can come up with an alternative that meets both their needs.
Thank you, Paul. So we have a motion on the table to affirm the director's decision to issue the permit while encouraging continued collaboration. Do we have a second?
I second.
Alan has a second. Any further discussion on the motion?
I agree completely. I realize we have to vote yes or no, but I do hope that both parties will take to heart the continued discussion and hopefully finding a common solution that appeases both sides. But we can't require them to do that, but I certainly hope that takes place.
Well said, Alan. Thank you. Hearing no more discussion, I will move to a roll call vote. Nikki Varney.
Nay.
Nay. Okay. Alan.
Yes. Yeah. Aye.
Tony Cato.
Aye.
Woody Dukes.
Aye.
And Dave, you are recusing yourself.
Yeah.
Keith Norris.
Aye.
Paul Rice.
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. The motion carries. Okay, well, we will now, thank you so much to everybody. We're going to move into our second appeal now, but I want to thank Mark and Sam and Glenn. I know you're up to bat again in just a moment here, but really appreciate everyone taking the time tonight. So going into our next appeal, we have the removed trees on the 500 block of Salem Heights Road. And I suggest this time, just due to some of the back and forth we had there, it may be more appropriate for us to ask questions after each presentation, just especially for clarification. In person, we tended to do that. I was thinking that for Zoom, it might be easier for us to do it all at once, but given the presentations we have, I think it might be better just to be ready to ask your clarifications, and we can always ask more at the end. So Glenn, I turn it over to you.
Okay. This may look familiar. We have a good evening, SPRAB board members. Again, my name is Glenn Davis. I'm the Chief Development Engineer with the Public Works Department, and we're talking now about the appeal of the tree removal permits along Salem Heights Avenue for the Wren Heights subdivision. The issue at hand is whether or not 3 trees already removed from the right-of-way of Salem Heights Avenue met the criteria for removal. Again, those criteria are found in SRC 86.090 and Administrative Rule 109/500 2.4. So here's a vicinity map showing the Wren subdivision site in yellow. The property abuts Salem Heights Avenue to the south. It is located about a quarter mile west of Liberty Road. Wren subdivision is a 34 lot subdivision proposed on 8 acres. City regulations require that streets abutting and development need to be improved to meet current standards. So in this area, Salem Heights Avenue is a collector street. It's quite substandard. It lacks bike lanes and sidewalks. Because there are a number of trees within and abutting Salem Heights Avenue, there is quite a bit of conflict between the future street improvements and the existing street trees. So I'll point out that we're not here to debate the merits of the subdivision itself, because council's already approved that. We are here to discuss the street tree removal along the south line of the subdivision. For additional background, Wren subdivision was approved by the planning administrator, acknowledging that 5 city trees would need to be removed through a street tree removal permit. That requirement was actually a condition 8 of the subdivision decision. The Wren subdivision was then appealed by the neighbors. The city council heard the appeal and ultimately affirmed the original decision. Neighbor appealed the council's decision to the State Land Use Board of Appeals, but that appeal was later dismissed by the appellant after the neighbor and the developer reached a voluntary settlement. I will add that the street alignment and the tree preservation were a subject of those appeals and had been settled as part of that process without further appeal. So part of the subdivision approval included a provision for the street improvements along Salem Heights Avenue and had an alternative street design that was improved as part of the approved as part of the conditions of approval. Here on the screen, I'm showing two different street cross sections. Again, I'm an engineer, so I can't stop myself. Here, on the top of the screen is the applicant's proposal for an alternative street cross section. And on the bottom of the screen, I show the standard collector street cross section from the city's transportation system plan. So it's kind of hard to read the numbers, so I'll point out here that a few distinct features about the different cross sections. On the bottom of the screen, the standard cross section shows a 7-foot landscape strip between the curb and the sidewalk. On the top of the screen, the alternative section for Wren subdivision increases that strip to 17 feet by shifting the street to the south and also by shifting the sidewalk onto private property into an easement. Next, the standard cross section has a 34-foot wide pavement section that provides 2 travel lanes and 2 bike lanes. The alternative cross section was reduced to 30 feet wide. And we were able to reduce the pavement width by eliminating the eastbound bike lane and replacing it with a share lane for cars and bicycles to share. I will add that that's mostly downhill for eastbound bikers, for those who know the area. This alternative street design has already been approved by the council decision, and so significant redesign of that collector street is not under purview of this hearing. The next, I'll explain why the street tree removal permit application was reduced from 5 to 3 city trees. Here on the screen shows the existing right-of-way in yellow from the original application with the 5 tree removal circled in red. The applicant submitted a survey late in the process showing that original right-of-way line was incorrect. This right-of-way line at the bottom of the screen was moved to the south in orange, and that amended right-of-way shows the 2 locust trees in the center were in fact outside the right-of-way and not subject to the street tree removal permit process. So instead, those trees are regulated under the tree conservation plan under SRC chapter 808, and that's also not a subject of this appeal hearing now. So next, I'll address a number of concerns expressed about the timing of the tree removal and the violation process. So here is a sequence of events. In February, the development obtained a permit to remove the private property trees. While removing those trees, the 3 street trees were also removed, originally thought to be 5 street trees. The developer applied for a street tree removal permit in June at the city's direction. Some have questioned that approach toward the permit process, but I'll point out that developers who violate the rules need to go through the same approval process that they would have needed to go through had they followed the rules. And that's really why they went through this permit process. So the director granted the permit, even though the trees had already been removed based on the criteria for approval. Swan appealed that director's decision. Tonight is that appeal hearing. So once SPRAB renders its decision, then the public works director will assess civil penalties as appropriate. The director has waited to assess those penalties because this permit decision may affect how the penalties are calculated. So to be clear, the assessment of civil penalties has nothing to do with whether or not the street trees meet the criteria for removal. Those are very different topics. We received many comments from both Swan and SCAN and individual citizens about this. And I understand that much of the testimony discusses the need for civil penalties, and staff does not dismiss those concerns. We agree that developers need to follow the rules. I don't want to minimize those in any way, but SPRAB does not have a regulatory role in the assessment of civil penalties. Instead, those penalties will be assessed later through a separate regulatory process. So lastly, the director's original decision granted the tree removal permit based on criteria requiring the demonstration that there's no reasonable alternative. So Salem Heights Avenue is a collector street in the Salem TSP, and the city council has approved the subdivision with an alternative street design for Salem Heights. The director's decision found that the only reasonable solution for constructing a collector street safely here, meeting the TSP standard, requires removal of those 3 street trees. So it's not possible to further reduce the street width without compromising safety as determined by council. And it's not possible to move the street farther south because of right-of-way limitations in case there was a question on that. So staff recommends that SPRAB affirm the director's decision to grant the permit and remove the 3 street trees from Salem Heights Avenue. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Glenn. So as I mentioned, I would like for us to have a chance to ask questions of Glenn now, and then we'll go through. But quickly, I want to clarify, Mickey, I just want to make sure you weren't trying to add comments to the previous discussion that I did not see you call or call on you, correct?
No, it's okay. I had some, but it really didn't matter. Honest, it's okay.
I really apologize if I missed you trying to raise your hand or anything. So I encourage everyone, obviously with Zoom, it's harder to keep track of everything. So if for anyone has comments, just unmute yourself and feel free to chime in, because I want to make sure we're all heard, and did not mean to leave you out in any way, shape, or form in the previous discussion.
I understand. No, I didn't feel that way. It's fine.
All right, well, let's, I'll keep some more eagle eyes out this time. Going through for questions for Glenn off of his presentation. Yeah, Woody.
So what happens if the permit is denied?
The likely scenario is that the land use condition, condition 8, would not have been met because the permit would not have been issued. So then there would be an amendment process to go through the land use process to rectify that land use condition. Of course, the trees can't be put back the same they were, so that's really not part of the process. And again, the violation process will still go forward whether the permit's issued or not. So that's really a separate. The code violation is slightly different than the subdivision approval process.
Glenn, can you
go ahead, Keith?
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Glenn, can you clarify that particular piece? You said that the code violation is separate than the approval process, and I understand that. But what I'm hearing you say is that regardless of kind of how this appeal plays out, penalties are being assessed. It's a matter of how this permit plays out affects the level of those penalties.
The process has not been fully vetted, but in certainly the amount of the violation, and that's not my role. My role is not to do the violation process. We have other people do that. But I'm told that certainly if the trees were permitted to be removed, the violation would likely be different than if the trees were not meeting the criteria to be removed, if that makes sense. So if it was a procedural error or they took them out too soon was one thing. If they shouldn't have been taken out at all is a different thing. And so that's why this process kind of is going to be completed before the violations or the penalties are established. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so.
I see Tom has appeared on our screens, and so I imagine he might have something to elaborate.
No, actually, Glenn answered the question quite well. So, it's either a technical violation or it's removing the trees without a permit. And so, but in either case, a sanction will be sought for taking out the trees prior to seeking the permit.
Woody, yes.
Yeah, it's the issue that concerns me the most is that they were aware that they needed a permit. The city did remind them that they needed a permit to remove them, but they still did not get a permit. So I'm not sure where to go with that, but I just think that kind of compounds the issue.
Julian?
Yes, Alan.
In the stack of background information I reviewed and that was provided on it, there was some circulation of emails, and one of them purported to be from the city manager that the penalty had already been decided. Is that just a misstatement or misunderstanding? Or
no, I am personally aware of communications that from the director to others that he's waiting for this decision before finalizing that penalty.
Okay, that's one reason I didn't quote the email from Steve Powers, because if it's not valid, there's no use circulating it.
Okay.
I do find it disheartening that, does it happen often, or is it standard practice that when somebody removes trees that they retroactively apply for a tree permit? Is that one of our requirements from the city?
It is, generally speaking, for development projects. If a violation occurs, that the developer is required to go back through that same approval process. You don't skip the process by violating.
Okay.
It's a general principle. Now, tree removal permits have been a bit unique, but this was certainly a case where we really felt it was appropriate to not avoid the process by violating.
Well, I guess from the way I read our responsibility with the board is we have to look, was the criteria solid for issuing of the permit? That's a different question from I think we take it personally, the fact that the developer chose to do this without approval and sort of in our face, as it were, from a city standpoint. But I think our scope is limited to look, was the issuance of the permit valid based upon the information and criteria that the city requires. So anyway, those are my concerns.
I think those are valid, and I think we're moving into some discussion that I do want to recognize. We still have to hear from our appellant and our applicant.
Yeah.
So we're, if there's any final clarifications for city staff specifically, Keith can do that, but otherwise I want to get through the other comments.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chair, am I guess in terms of the questions, Glenn provided a brief overview there of a lot of the content we were provided. So is it acceptable if I dig a little deeper into the content and the background material for clarifying city questions at this point, or will there be a time appropriate for that later?
Yes, I think that's appropriate for now.
Okay, so Glenn, the kind of first question, I think in finding the facts and findings number 9, it says that they applied for an after the fact street tree removal permit. And I'm reading that as more of a descriptive element of the permit, as opposed to there's no actual permit that exists that is an after the fact permit, right? That's not a formal designation.
You will not find that in the code or in our fee resolution of an after the fact permit. Yes, that's true.
Okay, just clarifying that. The other thing, and I don't have the page in front of me right now, but what I recall seeing in the, again, this gets more at the land use planning process perhaps, but one of the conditions in there, there were 2 conditions that I recall being related to trees. One of them talked about the tree preservation elements on the private property, and indicated that there would need to be city trees that would be removed. And it had in there that the removal of the city trees was tentatively approved as part of the planning process. And then the next condition was that they needed to seek tree removal permits to remove those trees. And I guess my question is what's the meaning of tentative approval to remove the trees, and what's the authority that tentative approval is being granted under?
That is a great question. So we recognized in the land use process that we had this this kind of a issue with how do you approve the street design and approve the tree removals without having authority to approve the tree removals, because that's really a later approval that SPRAB's involved with. So we knew that coming. And so we wanted to make it clear that we, as part of the land use decision, that the tree preservation was part of the approval process, and we preserved as many trees as possible, and recognized in the final decision that we knew 3 trees had to come out. And so we wanted to just acknowledge the fact that that was done knowingly. It was part of the design, but that we didn't have authority to finally approve them, and that had to come before the director and then SPRAB on appeal. So we recognize that I think the code code may need to change a bit about this process, because it seems to be a little bit of a loophole that should be closed. We've seen, so that this kind of exposed that uniquely from this project.
And I think one more, if I may, Mr. Chair, on a similar topic, you talked about that the trees had to be removed in order for this approved street to be built. And I guess, is that an approved construction, or is it at that stage of city council approval, is it a required construction? Is that a clear, am I making that distinction clear enough?
Maybe. I mean, the best illustration I can give that was the intention of it is in the land use process, the council or the planning administrator will do a tentative subdivision approval. So it's tentatively approved. And then there's a later in the process, there's a final plat that's the final approval. That's the legal document that goes to the recorder's office that creates the lots. And so there's a tentative process and a final. And so in this similar here, the tentative there's something to come later. And so that is not the land use process doesn't issue the building permit. It doesn't issue the construction permit. It doesn't issue the tree removal permit. Those are to come. So that was, but I said the tree removal permit is the only of those examples that has an appeal process. Everything else is really just more of a ministerial, I think is the term that's used, that doesn't have that same wrinkle.
So can you clarify then on that is the construction permit for the street construction, has that been approved?
The street construction permit is not approved because the street tree removal permit is not approved.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Unless there's any other pressing questions, I suggest we move on to our few more presentations, and then we'll have more time for staff deliberation or board deliberation and questions of staff. Next, we're going to hear from the applicant. I'm not sure who we have on behalf of the applicant presenting to us today.
Mark Ferris was representing the applicant. He couldn't be here because of an evacuation notice he had to rush home for. My name is Keith Wissenhunt. I'm the engineer and surveyor on the project. And I'm going to just touch on a couple of items. I think Glenn did an excellent job of framing the issues, explaining the code-related matters. I do want to make sure that a couple of things are clarified. First of all, the difference in right-of-way that was shown on those sheets one of the sheets that Glenn put up during his presentation was the result of boundary survey and a boundary resolution process that we went through. Initially, we used a previous survey from several years ago that was completed for the project. And as we went through the process deeper after the tentative map approval, we found that that right-of-way resolution that was used in the previous survey was not correct. I recorded a different boundary resolution that moved that line to the south, and as a result, showed it in different relation with those street trees, the trees in the right-of-way. So that I think is an important distinction. The other thing I think that's important to understand is in this process, we worked for an extended period of time back and forth with city staff to try and save as many trees as we possibly could. And the developer ultimately agreed to the alternate street section, which included dedication of additional easement width for the sidewalk outside of the right-of-way. So, and as Glenn mentioned in his presentation, we were able to preserve 19 of the 22 trees that would have ordinarily come out, and it came down to these three. These three trees, and again, Glenn had this very nicely shown in an illustration, are all on the street side of the curb. as Glenn mentioned, the criteria where it's not reasonable to construct the street without removing these trees is spot on. So with all those things being said, I think the only thing I would add is during this tree removal activity, a very senior and qualified individual with the city was actually there while the crews were doing the work, and made the comment that he didn't see any issues and things looked like they were going just fine. And so there was really no, there was not the realization that the trees that were being taken out were outside, were inside the city right away. Everybody, including the city inspector, thought they were on the private property, and it was not unreasonable to take those out. So with all that being said, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think that like I said, Glenn did an excellent job, as he always does, framing the issue and presenting the facts, and I really don't have anything more to add.
Thank you for that. We'll now have some questions or clarifications from the board. I just want to clarify, you said a city official was present at the removal, that's at the removal of the 3 that you're talking about now that for this hearing?
He was there while the work in that area was being done. I believe he was there when those trees were being removed, but I wasn't there, so I can't say that he was.
And is this Mylan that we're talking about, or the urban forester, or is this someone else?
No, he's a public works inspection supervisor. I can tell you the name if you'd like to know the name. He's one of the most respected guys down there, Jim Crosby. When it comes to public works construction, he knows his stuff. And that's why I think it was reasonable for the applicant to rely on his comments, basically saying, well, you know, we're doing what we should be doing.
But in this case, it sounds like he was incorrect that so the permit was not issued.
He was, but if you look at the location of the trees and the diameter of the trees, the center of this tree symbol is on Glenn's exhibits is the center of the tree. The way we locate those trees, we locate the center of the tree. A 32-inch tree has a 16-inch radius, and if you draw a 16-inch radius circle around the center of those tree symbols, in both cases, it touches the right-of-way. So we're talking about a foot and 3 inches in a situation where there's no instrumentation and no staking out there. And at the bottom, you know, the trees get even wider. And so it was actually further, it was actually a portion of the tree was outside the city right-of-way on private property. So, I mean, from that perspective, I can see how it would become very confusing to be able to determine this tree's in, this tree's out.
Other comments from the board before I continue to follow up? Woody, did you have anything you wanted to add?
It's that they were told specifically that they had to get permits to remove those trees.
Other board member comments or clarifications?
I would add, I would have trouble with a city inspector approving it arbitrarily.
The city inspector didn't approve the permit. He just observed the work and said everything's going the way he would expect it to go. So he didn't even notice. My point is, he didn't even notice that the tree was within the street right away.
But the permit was issued from this, the reminder was issued from the city that, so there was, the project on your behalf was notified. And so I think that was the document.
Absolutely. And as Glenn mentioned, the removal of the trees meets the criteria and is the public works director is supportive of its issuance. The trees couldn't be saved. If you know, if that street's going to be built the way it was approved by council, the trees couldn't be saved.
Okay, Mickey, were you about to ask a question?
Well, I was going to say, while they were there before they cut down the trees, I mean, obviously there wasn't a notice on the trees announcing that they were going to be removed. I mean, the whole thing with the process just isn't right here.
Tony, Cato, I see you had your hand raised as well.
Yeah, in a situation like this, it seems I've seen, there's an employee of the city there, whether they're the right employer or not to make that call on the site. That's beside the point. But I guess the burden of proof is on the applicants. You know, they need to prove one way or the other that the center line of a particular tree is within or outside of right of way. I guess is what I would say.
The applicant is not suggesting the trees were on private property. The only thing my comments were intended to communicate was that because of the proximity to that right-of-way line and the way trees go from a fairly constant diameter, and then as you get down toward the bottom, they widen out. It was just the combination of the circumstances made it difficult to tell. And that was the nature of my comment is all. What the applicant understands that there was a condition that a permit was required. He never intended to take trees out that were out in the street. It just, because of the proximity, it just happened that way. But the tree removal does meet the criteria established in code for removal of those trees. And the street could not have been constructed or can't be constructed without removing those 3 trees.
You can't make just an arbitrary statement like that because they were identified on the plan. And just because they were approved, even though they were approved to be removed, they weren't approved to be removed. They were, they in the process later on, but they did not have, there were no permits issued to remove those trees.
And that's correct. Again, the point I'm trying to make, and I don't mean to be argumentative at all, I just want to make sure everybody understands, it was the confusion arose because of the proximity to the right of way. Nobody ever thought that was clearly out in the right of way and we're just going to go take those trees out and be done. That was not the intent. The intent was everybody thought, including the city inspector, which provided some kind of, I think, satisfaction for the applicant whenever he was out there that kind of activity was okay, that they were taking out the right trees. So that was the nature of my comment, is that if these had been 5 feet further into the city right away, it'd have been very clear they were in the city right away and they wouldn't have been removed.
I saw Alan and then Keith both had comments.
Well, I don't want to drag this out, and I realize the point being made, but offering up an excuse that it was partially the city's responsibility, I just don't find palatable.
And I don't say it was their responsibility. I just said he was there and didn't say stop, that's in the right of way. That's all. I just am saying if the city inspector could be confused, the applicant could have been confused.
Well, I'm not too sure who was confused, but there should be a project manager or construction manager who knows the requirements of the permitting requirements. And to me, that had to have been a weak link in there somewhere. Some supervisor was supervising removing these trees inappropriately. That's my view on it.
Keith, what were you gonna ask?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if so part of the permitting requirements, right, is the idea that there's no reasonable alternative, and in the applicant's materials here, they have that the applicant has demonstrated there are no reasonable alternatives to removing these trees, and I just am curious and kind of where did the applicant demonstrate that, and how did the applicant demonstrate that? I didn't see that directly in here, other than in the particular. There are parts of it in the land use process, but I guess in terms of the tree permit application process, how was that lack of reasonable alternative identified or demonstrated?
From my perspective, it was during the land use process. There was a very lengthy back and forth between the city and the applicant's engineering staff to provide alternatives to the city, and where we moved sidewalks, where we regraded, where the sidewalk was lower than the street, where we provided different street widths. And I think Glenn can also support that there was a very cooperative effort between city staff and the applicant's engineer to try and save as many trees as we could. And we wound up saving 19 out of the 22. And I think but that was where that alternatives analysis occurred. And it was because of the street section having to be approved as part of the tentative map process that the two kind of got, I'm going to say, meshed together.
And so that, if I may just follow, that process involves specifically these 3 trees and the discussion around alternative for these 3 particular, or I guess really those 5 trees at that time, involved discussions around those particular ones?
Well, it involved all 22 trees.
Okay.
I mean, when we provided our initial submittal, it was the standard section with the standard sidewalk location and the standard grading, and we were wiping out all those trees. And we worked with city staff because city staff says, geez, is there something we can do here? And when we went through a process where we reduced the number of trees that were coming out down to the 3, the 2 locust trees in the intersection are on private property, and those were going to come out because of the Downton intersection needed to line up with the intersection across the street, or needed to be in the proximity that it is.
I hope it helps. I just put that drawing on the screen to help you to see the proximity between the trees and the construction. I don't know if that helps.
And so just to clarify, the 2 trees that were then taken off that were determined to be on private property and no longer part of the 5, now that we're down to 3, those are still being removed, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then so when you're saying 19 out of 22 trees have been saved, are those trees that are on public property then? Because otherwise it would still be 17 out of 22, correct? Or am I misunderstanding that number?
If you're asking me, the 2 locust trees were not really ever part of the effort to save trees out along Salem Heights because they were in that intersection. The 19 out of 22 doesn't consider the 2 locust trees in the intersection. It considers the oaks and the other trees that are generally west of the proposed Downton intersection.
That clarifies it. Thank you. So we still need to hear from the appellant, the Neighborhood Association, unless there are further comments from the board or questions while we have the applicant on video or phone. Okay, well, we will open it up now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. We will now open it up to, I believe, Ted Burney from the Neighborhood Association.
Ted Burney should have access. Mitch, can you make Ted a co-host?
I'm unmuted now, Tony. Thank you, but I think Mitch does have to make me a co-host to start my video. I'm getting a message, unable to start video. I'll try again. There I am. Hello, everybody. Thank you for your superpowers.
Thank you for being here. We can hear you and see you, so it's a good
Okay, great. Davis has great technology, and unfortunately Swan is not up to those standards, but I did send you all some testimony that had photos in the testimony, and if at times I refer to them like that, I apologize, but please follow along on the testimony. They're pretty good representations for you. And anyhow, with this time of infernos all around us, it's a little hard to focus on this issue, but perhaps trees are much more important now as we're losing them left and right across the state. So my name is Ted Burney. I live in Ward 7. I'm the land use chair for Southwest Association of Neighbors, better known as SWAN. I'm a volunteer, just like many of you, and I work with our neighborhood association to improve and protect the quality of life for everybody who lives in or visits our area of Salem. And I'm speaking tonight not only for myself, but on behalf of 22 members of our neighborhood association who voted unanimously at our July meeting to file an appeal against the approval for the permit for removal of 5 trees on the city right of way. And now after a resurvey, we know that's 3 trees, but that does call into question perhaps the whole survey, but that's another issue, not for this meeting. So in my presentation, I'll make the following case, if I may. The permit approval for removal of the trees was flawed because there are reasonable alternatives to the planned construction, which supposedly required removal of the trees. We base this on the fact that it's a standard design that was initially being proposed for a half collector when trying to be applied to the entirety of Salem Heights. Now, as you know, our appeal may be a bit unusual because in fact, the trees have, as you are aware, already been removed. But let me give you a brief timeline again. Mr. Davis did a great job on that and has better graphics than we do. But what we find particularly interesting is that the trees were cut down on April 15th without a permit, and city staff has confirmed the lack of issuance of a permit. But what's particularly interesting in this regard is that on February 28th of 2020, when a grading permit was obtained to begin removal of trees on private property, then city staff on March 10th followed up with a written reminder to the developer, and you've already heard this, regarding the need for removal permits for city tree removal. And now what was really cool, we think city staff did them a big favor, was they also included an application with this reminder. So that was a nice courtesy of city staff. But June 2020, the trees were down. The developer applied for an after the fact permit for city tree removal, and the director approved the tree removal permit based on criteria, as we know, in SRC 86090A8, which says no reasonable alternative exists. So bear with us, because we're going to try and tell you a few alternatives that we have come up with, but we think city staff, pretty cool, and city designers could do a much better job than we did if given time and opportunity. So let me cut to the chase here. Let's take a look at the location of the trees. If you can remember where Director Davis had his nice graphic. Basically, trees that were in question, the locusts, they're no longer in question with us. We're very concerned about the white oaks. And so let's take a look at these questions. And in fairness to the developers, they did work with their engineer, worked with city staff to come up with an alternative construction idea for placing a sidewalk behind some trees on the west side of the proposed extension of Doughton Street. This out of the box thinking was a good idea, but more of this type of thinking could have been applied to the fir and the white oaks that were removed without a permit on the proposed location on the east side of Doughton. Okay, so the white oaks in particular are trees 1001 and 10002, if you have the document to refer to. And they're in the lower right, and they're a little closer to the current roadway. We did a lot of our measuring and a lot of our looking based on the north edge of the current roadway. And the trees that are being preserved are on the north edge of the roadway, and they're being preserved with the innovative thinking. We don't know who it came from, we just needed more of it. So the white oaks in question that were dropped are what we call a class 1 tree. A class 1 tree requires special adherence to an admin rule 109-500-2.4. Yeah, everybody knows about that one. For you have to look at that prior to removal for lack of existing alternatives. And the rule establishes the criteria for analysis of reasonable alternatives. For a class 1 tree, which are the white oaks, and they're not small trees, they're big trees, 36 inches at the stumpage easily. The rule states alternatives that must be examined include redesign of the project, use of alternative construction practices or materials, alternative locations for the work, and other methods. Okay, so we're going to throw a few of our ideas your direction, see what you think of them. So our city staff, though, we think is pretty good in terms of design, and they've come up with reasonable alternatives in the past. And in your packet, I sent you some things that look like this. There we go. Kind of a nice segue around a tree. not a standard design. Here's what we call, oh, mini design. There we go. Can you see that? Goes around a tree, not standard. Here's something pretty unusual. There's a sidewalk. Oh, there's a big tree in the background. Let's make the sidewalk and mark it with delineators. That's pretty cool. But the one you're all familiar with is this one, and I'll hold it up for you to study. It's Liberty Street, the big oak, and Liberty and Mission. And our city staff has come up with a great alternative here. So as a reminder, the standards that are being applied at Wren Heights are just design standards for streets. They're not mandates, okay? They're guidelines for design and are flexible depending on a variety of criteria, such as topography, existing structures, or immovable objects. And the standards are not set in stone and can be changed, redrawn, or put in place with final approval from the director. So you saw the tree with sidewalk curve, you saw a tree with a mini sidewalk curve, you saw a sidewalk with delineators, and you saw the sidewalk blending around the tree at Liberty Street, which included curb, gutter, and bike lane. Now, Salem Heights is designated as a collector street in the Salem Transportation Plan. And if you're not familiar with it, it's actually a country road that has not been developed. It does not function as a collector street. It functions as a local or neighborhood street. And the proposed construction of a portion of Salem Heights Avenue, not the school, to become more of a collector street at the Wren Heights development looks at a standard template design of a 35-foot width for a whole collector type A street. And so the proposal at Wren Heights in condition 7, as you heard, is for a half collector. Bear with me on the math here, for a width of 17 feet. But in condition 6 of preliminary acceptance for Salem Heights, the city was given right-of-way extending 30 feet from the center line. The current lane is 9.5 feet. So this allows nearly 21 feet of extra room to make design adjustments. Okay, that's cool. But the center line could be relocated and recentered according to this new right-of-way allowance and in conjunction with the existing right-of-way on the south side of Salem Heights Avenue. And this realignment could be set to better conform to what is called a meandering right-of-way, the length of Salem Heights. And it could have been shifted, and it could have shifted the roadway away from the trees that were cut. So as an illustration of a center line adjustment, if you shift a line merely a quarter inch every 10 feet, in 640 feet, you'll have gently slid that center line 16 inches. Hey, cool. Start the shift earlier at wider portions west of Wren Heights, say near Crestview, and you have a proportionate gain in space away from the trees of 32 inches in only 1,280 feet. This shift would provide space away from the road edge for preserving the trees. Now, the guidelines for travel lane width on a collector A street are suggested to be 15 feet. But remember, these are suggestions, they're design guidelines, they're not mandates. And lo and behold, the city's performed something called the Vista Commercial Corridor Study, and it recommends a lane width of 11 feet. Vista Commercial Corridor Study says we'd like lane widths of 11 feet, presumably to slow traffic. The current lane width on Salem Heights is 9.5 feet. Extending the width to 11 feet would have required 18 additional inches. Do you think 18 inches could have been garnered from either side of the roadway? The alternative here could have saved the white oaks and the fir. Now we've heard about bike lanes. You know, we would like bike lanes. They eliminated them from one side of the street, but bike lanes could be narrowed or relocated, and the sidewalks could have a minimal curve near the trees or could have gone behind the trees, just as they are on the west side of the proposed Downton extension. And condition 7 does indeed place those sidewalks west of Downton within a property line easement, north of the property line, to preserve the existing trees. That is a great alternative. Why was this alternative not pursued? So it could have been followed again on the city trees. These are city trees that were cut. So trees that are now being preserved, we went out and measured, are 9 feet from the current north edge of existing Salem Heights pavement. And we do commend the developer and the city designers for saving these trees with the design solution that placed a sidewalk on that easement. That was great. The white oaks, though, that were illegally dropped were 6 feet from the edge of current pavement. The difference between 6 and 9 feet, you all know this, 3 feet, or again, only 18 inches of give on either side of the roadway. Again, do you think we could find 3 feet in over 8 acres? We believe you could, especially since there are a number of lot line adjustments going in this property. And we believe there's room to find an alternative design there. Now, something you may not be aware of, especially for Mr. Norris, who I think is new to the commission, but residents of Salem Heights Avenue have been working with a senior city planner in a group called the Salem Heights Refinement Plan. We've been working with the developer, we've been working with the city, and this plan seeks to find solutions for neighbors' concerns as Salem Heights Avenue is further developed. It is doubtful, we've been told, that Salem Heights Avenue improvements would warrant the issuance of a bond, and Salem Heights is not a top priority in terms of improvement and maintenance. So any improvements that are made have to be made with the knowledge it needs to fit within Salem Heights Refinement Plan and the concerns of the neighborhood. We don't want to have a developed roadway go nowhere. Does no one any good. But one of the concerns from the Salem Refinement Plan is safety. So we propose another option for Salem Heights Avenue to the proposed standard guidelines for collector streets. It's a version of what we call a road diet. It's a simple narrowing of the road near the areas of the trees that were cut. Okay. Instead of the full half collector in this area being considered, construction of an 11-foot lane width concept could work. And another option that may have saved tree 1002, it's the white oak, is a change in the turning radius for the proposed Doughton Street extension. This is another alternative. Curb radius may be reduced to 5 feet less than standard radius guidelines in any of the following circumstances: to prevent conflict with immovable objects or to fit improvements within available right-of-way. But not only can we reduce the turning radius, we can also increase the radius when directed by the city traffic engineer in order to accommodate turning movements. Increasing or decreasing turning radius could change the street alignment and could have been a reasonable alternative to save the white oaks, 1002 and possibly 1001. So city code does give the public works director wide latitude in applying standards for street construction. And bear with me here because we've got some excellent photos for you. They're really.
Ted, I just want to give you a notice. You have 2.5 minutes left in the allotted time.
We have 3 photos, they're in your packets, that show the same street with a bike lane, no bike lane, 2 sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to cut to the chase here. Alternative designs have been applied in these photos. They come from different portions of the same street. And this deals with alternative street standards. But this is our other one. We think a rain garden, this is a rain garden that's being built under construction, features a curve in alignment, and it could that same principle have been applied as an outside curve to better conform to the radius change in the proposed Doughton extension. You can see where the white oaks could have gone instead of standard sewer and gutter. Okay, so we've covered a few reasonable design alternatives quickly here that include possible lane width reduction, sidewalk or bike lane relocation, location-specific narrowing of sidewalks or bike lanes, relocation of the center line to create room for the trees and to better match the future refinement of Salem Heights, as well as alternatives to standard practices like stormwater drain installations. We believe there are more options that our city staff could come up with because they're pretty creative. And as a reminder, we're no longer addressing the locust trees, but we do have a question. What happened to the wood from these oak trees? Didn't go to the city. If it was ground up, it was a waste. So we have 2 missing trees with pretty high commercial value. So in closing, I'd like to reiterate for all of Swan that we believe reasonable alternatives to cutting the trees down did exist. We've listed several alternatives ranging from a shift in center line, etc. but we'd like you, Salem Parks and Rec Board, to find that granting the permit for tree removal after the fact was indeed in error and should not be affirmed. And we would also like the board to enforce Salem's tree ordinance and include advice to the director, not only on appropriate fines, but a request that the developer work with the senior city planner. Okay. And payment was mentioned earlier of only a reapplication fee, and we don't believe this is an adequate enforcement of compensation for these violations. The value of the city-owned trees that were cut, not only in terms of commercial value, but also intrinsic value, should be considered. And we respectfully ask, even though it's not your purview for this, to ask for our $283 appeal fee to be returned either by the city or the developer to the Swan City account. Thank you for your time, your patience, your commitment to the process, and putting up with me and my terrible graphics.
Thank you very much, Ed. We will now, if you'll stay on video for a minute here, we can have a moment for board members to ask you questions. Yeah, Dave.
Well, my question is whether these street alternatives were brought up during the subdivision process, the subdivision review process.
If that's a question for me, Dave, I don't know exactly on that, but we do have a question because I skipped over a few things because of the time constraints, apologize. But we did have a statement that said from the developer in terms of reasonable alternatives analysis. The reasonable alternatives analysis we were sent simply says there are no alternatives. There is no list. There are no options given. None saying we did this, we did this. So I wasn't in any of the meetings that may have gone on. So I can't really specifically answer your particular question, but we would have liked to have seen a list of alternatives that were considered and thrown out the door.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If I might try to answer that question, I was involved in that process. This is
Mark, let's take a minute here. We're going to get through any more clarifications for Ted, and then we'll have a chance for you to speak again during in just a moment here.
Sure.
In case anything else comes up. Woody.
Yeah. First of all, on the alternatives that you were talking about, did a certified arborist or certified consultant look at any of those alternatives?
No, I haven't had the chance to meet Mylan yet, so.
I mean, yeah, but you're talking about the city's urban forester?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. You're saying he's the one who helped with the changes in the.
I would think he'd be a
Side
great
Street?
resource to go to. I've heard nothing but good things about him.
Yeah, well, it should have been sooner in the process. I have a problem with trying to save trees. Just, well, you look at the maple tree at Liberty and Mission, where that sidewalk is actually put back where the sidewalk previously was. But if you look at that tree now, it's all but dead.
Right. I believe the developer did cut a major root.
Correct. You cut a major root on the building side when they put the building in, but they replaced the sidewalk without all that much damage to the sidewalk side, but that side of the tree is also dying, and maples tend to die on the same side that the roots are on that are affected. So anyway, I'm not, I'm a tree person. I was a certified arborist for 9 years, but anyway, I don't want to save trees just for the sake of trying to save them and then take them out later on, because the city has under Chapter 86 has the critical tree zone, which allows for roots clear out to the drip line or beyond, depending on the circumstances. But if there are many trees that are tried to be saved but just turn out being removed within 5 years after they tried to save them, just for the sake of trying to save them. So
yeah, it would have been a good effort, and I think it's easier to pour a straight line than a curve. You're probably right there.
Yeah, well, it's also when you put in curbs, they also have to dig down certain. I don't know if Mark, if they were going to in the development of widening that street, would that street be torn up? Would it be added to on the edge? Would it be dug up? What kind of treatment would be to the edge of that roadway? Because it has to have some support at the just just not straight up and down. But anyway, I don't know. What Mark
One
would say.
clarification I want to make for all of us, Woody, because I noticed you just did it too. So I was just told that the name showing up is Mark Ferris, who just gave the presentation. His name is actually Keith Weisenhunt, I believe.
Oh.
And so there's I thought he was addressing.
I thought I
Keith.
wrote it down. No, not. I was talking about Mark's city staff.
Okay, understood. But Keith on the phone, apologies for calling you the wrong name there, as it showed up wrong on Zoom.
So I'm good. I'm done.
Alan, yes.
As we move this process along, I want to congratulate the Neighborhood Association for one of the best researched, documented, and presented presentations I've seen in a long time from Neighborhood Association. So obviously this is a passion. They put a lot of work into it, and that work and their attention to detail really shows in this presentation.
Yeah, I also wanted to say that too. It was very amazingly well done.
Except for the
We have some time for other board questions, but I also want to note that we do have a few public testimonials coming up in just a moment here during the public comment period. I know we have at least 3 people who signed up to speak. So any other questions for Ted about the presentation? Okay, well, thank you so much, Ted. Appreciate the well-researched and well-presented information. And we will now move into the public comment period. Tony, I think this time we actually have some people signed up.
We do. We have Ron, and I hope I don't massacre his name. I believe it's Eachus.
Ekus will be fine.
Okay. He is first, and then followed by Bill Dixon and Janine Stice.
Okay. Ron, would you please give us your testimony? We usually say about 3 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Ron Ekus. I've been living on Salem Heights Avenue since 1989. In the allotted 3 minutes or so, there isn't enough time to go through my written comments and the exhibits that were attached. So I'm going to summarize the exhibits and urge you to refer to the comments and the exhibits, and particularly the right-of-way map, which is Exhibit B. As I've listened to this, one of the things that occurred to me is that we're in a closed loop. Staff maintains that there's no reasonable alternative because the design has already been approved. And if that's the case, then what is it we're really appealing here? What case can we make? Well, I believe we can make a case that there are reasonable alternatives. The burden of proof to prove that there's not is on the staff. And so far, the only thing they've said is, and the only thing the applicant has said is that there's no alternative because the land use decision design was approved and the trees had to be removed. But just because that design requires removal doesn't mean there aren't other designs that could reasonably protect the trees and still meet the goals for circulation of traffic associated with the subdivision. The TSP and the code give the staff the flexibility to design alternatives that I think could have saved the trees had they not been illegally removed. The improvements on the east side of Downton on Salem Heights do not have to mirror those on the west side. The problem here is that the staff has applied a corrector street design option to an entire street for what is only a half street improvement. And the reality is that the remainder of Salem Heights, including the south side of the Wren Heights cross section, is not going to be developed to collector street standards. The city initiated this Salem Heights refinement process to plan for future improvements. In that process, the city has stated it will not be acquiring any additional right-of-way. So if you look at the right-of-way maps in Exhibit B, you can see this means that there are only small patches on the street that can accommodate the collector street required 60 feet of right-of-way. Salem Heights has no sidewalks and it has no paths. Hence, in order to meet the plan's stated goal of preserving the character of the neighborhood, any improvements in areas other than Wren Heights will have to involve meandering path and street configurations and the measurements of those paths are not likely to be uniform. By requiring this particular half-street improvement via a cross-section based on an erroneous assumption about the future development of the south side of the street, staff's eliminated options for protecting the trees that would involve adjustments that could be made in the south side of the right-of-way. It's reasonable to assume the flexibility of the TSP and the code provides is sufficient to allow alternatives that would have protected the trees. By either
Ron,
various-
your time's just about up.
Okay, well, let me close with this one final point, and that's on enforcement, which the staff asserts is not an issue here. It is indeed an issue. The board has authority to add instructions and conditions to the director in any decision it renders. And the worst case scenario is to do what staff has suggested with its closed loop. If you affirm that an after the fact order approving the illegally cut trees prevented if you approve the after effect order on the basis that the land use decision was already made, and then you simply allow the director to require the developer to pay for a second application without so much as a civil fine is required, then one wonders if this process has any use at all, and if the appeal process and the Boulder Road plays is merely an illusion. Thank you.
Ron, thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that. We have two more public comments. I believe next is Bill Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Bill Dixon. I live at 608 Salem Heights Avenue South. I want to talk about how the Salem Heights community can help the city remedy a difficult situation involving city trees improperly removed from their neighborhood street. As Mr. Burney and Mr. Ekus have noted, community members from the Salem Heights Avenue neighborhood already are working with the city to plan the future of the road. As a member of the group, I am a member of the group, but I'm speaking tonight as an individual. And can you see me okay? I'm getting a message saying they've asked me to start the video.
I can see you.
Okay, great. The Salem Heights Advisory Group is led by a senior transportation planner from city staff and consists of 10 people with ties to the homes and schools in the neighborhood. Their goal is a plan that does the following: improves safety, enhances usability, reflects the character of the neighborhood, and fits with the city's overall transportation plan. The planning process draws inspiration from a community open house held in June 2019 at Salem Heights Elementary School. That event drew 24 neighborhood residents along with city planning staff. Residents identified the tree canopy along Salem Heights as a major advantage of the street. Staff studied that input and presented initial findings to the advisory group in December. Staff said at that time that both community sentiment and limitations on city rights of way made it unlikely that a uniform design could be imposed on the street. Instead, staff said reasonable alternatives should be developed for different sections. One goal of this approach was to protect the trees along the street. Staff continued to work on design concepts until COVID-19 interrupted work. Work resumed in July, and the committee is to meet again later this month. During that meeting, the group will review design alternatives for different areas of the street. As you can see, the advisory group is geared to finding reasonable alternatives that improve the street and also protect trees. This work should include recommending alternative designs for replanting the destroyed city trees as close to their original location as possible. It also should include alternative designs to protect the 17 remaining city trees next to the subdivision, including 12 white oaks. In short, I urge you to capitalize on the Salem Heights Advisory Group to find community-friendly solutions to replace the city trees that were improperly removed and protect those that remain. Thank you.
Thank you. You came in at 2:57. That was pretty impressive. Well timed. Thank you for those comments. Appreciate those. And our last comment from Janine Stice. I may be mispronouncing your last name and I apologize.
That's fine. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. Chair McDowell and board. My name is Janine Stice. I've been actively involved in my neighborhood. Just Walk, Salem Kaiser, South Salem Connect, Swan and Salem Heights Refinement Work Group that Bill just mentioned. Although I am chair of Swan, my comments tonight are mine as an individual. My family resided on Sunridge Drive within a few blocks of Salem Heights Avenue for 19 years. Sunridge Drive is a narrow neighborhood street anchoring the west end of Salem Heights Avenue, where Wren Heights is being developed, as the designated collector street. It's less than a mile in length. Sunridge Drive is a neighborhood two-way street that is about 13 feet wide at one point, widens to approximately 22 feet where it intersects Salem Heights, and narrows again to 15 feet for two lanes. It lacks both sidewalks and bike lanes. Anchoring the east end of Salem Heights Avenue is Liberty, a narrow arterial street that boasts a sidewalk but lacks space to accommodate designated bike lanes. When the City Council approved Wren Heights development plan in June of 2019, city staff noted that trees would likely need removal, but prior to public construction permitting, the developer would need to obtain tree removal permits. Several neighbors reached out to city staff early and often to establish a process for input for possible alternatives that would spare the large trees that anchor the character of the street and maintain the feel of the former country road on which Salem Heights is sited. The Swan Neighborhood Association's May 2019 minutes reflect conversation with the developer, noting both safety and tree preservation were priorities. The developer documented in an email to city staff 2 days after the meeting that he, quote, mentioned we were exploring alternative street designs where sidewalk pavement deviates from the norm to preserve trees, unquote. I felt confident that future conversations would include the creation of several alternatives that would result in tree preservation, particularly of the large white oaks owned by the city. The need for a separate tree removal application process and the conversations neighbors had with both city staff and the developer led many to believe possible alternatives would come forward that both preserved the trees and provided practical connectivity to the adjacent neighborhood streets. The approval language that allowed for the alternatives and supported the positions neighbors expressed early on with city staff and the developer, namely that Salem Heights was a unique collector street with poor visibility and trees that were to be protected. Based on the earlier meetings with the developer and staff, it seemed several alternatives were being developed that would preserve these trees since the designated collector street was built on an original country road with varying rights of easement that the city had not yet acquired and may never be able to afford. Neighbors made it clear we did not want to see collector street standards used in this unique situation, one where the collector street lacks the necessary easements to allow connectivity to adjacent streets, because often this results in sidewalks to nowhere in front of developments. In this case, it would offer little to no connectivity to either Liberty Street, which was narrow and lacks the space to allow the standard 6-foot bike lane, and Sunridge, which was mentioned earlier, was only about 22 feet total width at the intersection.
You're at time. If you could try and wrap it up now.
Yeah.
Thank
In
you.
summary, we feel this was a missed opportunity that should be righted by this board in supporting the appeal. There are multiple country roads similar to Salem Heights and South Salem that are designated collector streets that have little to no developed infrastructure. City staff could honor the conversations they've had with neighbors and develop unique multiple alternative designs for these collector streets that preserves the livability of the tree canopy and allows for slowing traffic. Otherwise, we continue to end up with sidewalks to nowhere, bike paths that end abruptly in the community process that wastes volunteer time.
Thank you so much. We greatly appreciate your public comment. Thank you, all three of you, for giving us that great insight from the neighborhood. We are now going to move away from public comment, and we're going to move into questions from the board of staff, and then we'll go through a final rebuttal and statements from both the appellant and the applicant. So this is a time now where we as board members can ask some questions of Glenn that you might have that have surfaced from the presentations we've had so far. I'll start with one. Glenn, a question I guess that keeps coming up for me is just this idea of precedent. And I think you touched on this slightly at the start, but recognizing this is a unique situation as with the previous hearing, but obviously wanting to make sure that I think as one of the testimonials provided, this idea that not disregarding the process of getting a permit altogether? And is this something where this is a rare case, or is this something where after the fact permits happen? I know that as you joked with Keith, that's not, you're not going to find that in city code, but I do wonder if that's something that is a rarity or if that's happens frequently.
To our knowledge, it's the first time we've done it for a tree permit. It is very common in building permits. It's very common in utility permits and other kind of construction permits where the work starts without permits and they have to go back through the approval processes. So that is a common practice in development as a whole. So yeah, it is a unique scenario that we don't think has come up before for tree removal permits to our knowledge.
Thank you. And a quick follow-up, I guess I would just love your clarification. Were you aware that there was the public works staff, Jim, I missed his last name, that was out there at the time of this removal or around this removal, kind of signing off on it informally?
Yeah, let me explain. Yes, I do. I am aware of what happened. Let me explain for background for that. So with these projects, there is a city inspector who is visiting the site daily. And the inspector is looking for erosion control concerns, looking to make sure they have erosion control measures up. And that person's going around looking at 12, 15, 20 projects a day. So that is the nuances of, do they have this particular permit for these particular trees? Are those trees permitted appropriately? That's not the inspector's role in that sense. They're looking at silt fences. They're looking at covering ground disturbed areas for erosion purposes and things like that. Tree protection fencing for those trees that are protected. So in the sense of, were they there and approving this particular tree removal? That's not the role of that inspector. So there was an inspector on site. He's on site every day looking for different things. And so now I want to, so when Keith says he was here and he looked at it, he thought it was okay. I can't really affirm that completely, but I will say that that Keith knows he didn't follow the process. There was a notice required, there was a permit required, and so to say the inspector somehow approved it is really not accurate. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Other questions from the board? Dave, yeah.
One question I have is related to the grading that was done. I assume that's done under a permit, and I'm wondering if it's possible to coordinate the tree removal permits on the city trees with when we are issuing a permit for grading of a property where we know that they're going to be removing vegetation. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, and I can explain that briefly. So the staff and the applicant were fully aware when they came in to get an erosion control permit that there was a tree removal permit needed, and that had not gone forward yet. And so when we mentioned that we notified the applicant, well, that notification came as part of that permit process. They came to get a permit. We said, oh, by the way, you don't have the street tree removal permit, so this permit is limited to private property. It's limited to the trees on private property. And so that was all part of the process. And that's why we know that we notified them not to remove those trees. And that's so the notification was all part of one process.
Okay, thank you. It sounds like it's already coordinated then.
We think so.
Okay.
Other questions? I guess, Glenn.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes, no, please, Mickey.
Boy, I keep going through this loop here, because one of the things that really throws me off is, well, Glenn did mention that this is the first time this has occurred with a tree permit, but he said that there are times when there is work that occurs without a permit, and then that work has to go back through an approval process. And that's what I kind of see here with the final subdivision approval that was September 9th of 2019, where the condition 8 was that there had to be issuance of, before any, construction permits can be permitted anyway, there has to be that tree removal permit, but there wasn't. And so I guess, I don't know if I really have a question, but I would certainly think that they would have to go back through the approval process since that condition can no longer be met. I mean, that's what I'm kind of seeing here, because I don't see how the city can possibly approve a permit for work for something that doesn't exist. So that's where I'm standing on this. I guess it's more of a comment than anything. I'll just leave it at that.
I think that's an important clarification. Glenn, is there anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I really, that is part of the deliberation process, that you will discuss those issues amongst yourselves.
Okay.
And Mr. Chair, can I ask, Glenn, can you put up your slide that defines, from your perspective and from staff perspectives, what the issue at hand is for us?
I will try.
Just because I think there's been a lot of discussion around around the land use planning process, which I gather is not our purview per se. But I think this.
So that is.
Yeah, I think so. So to kind of Mickey's point, I guess my question here is, the way I'm reading this, and I'm curious what your read on it is do those 3 trees meet these criteria? And the criteria are all about permit to remove trees, and mentions the trees, right? And to Mickey's point, those trees don't exist. And so I don't know that a permit can meet those criteria, because those criteria no longer apply, because those trees no longer exist. So that's, I was just wanted to see how this was, how you had kind of framed it for us before we start our own deliberations here. So thank you.
Okay, yeah, that is. I don't have a lot of precedent to point to for this happening in the past.
Glenn, could you then add anything more about the reasonable alternative discussion that was brought up? Yeah, could you add anything more about the reasonable alternative discussion that was seen? It sounds like, from what we heard from the neighborhood association, from public testimony, that there was very little communicated outside of just there was no reasonable alternatives. And so it'd be wonderful to hear you expand on whether or not you feel that they were adequately assessed in the process.
I guess the position the staff had taken as part of this process is that the council has approved a design for Salem Heights construction as part of the language process, and so that's, in our minds, that was a given. And there was alternatives. There was a number of alternatives as part of that entire process, and that was a lengthy land use process to figure out how we'd save trees. As we mentioned, there was what we thought was 22 trees, and we thought we saved 19 of them. But now that's those numbers may have changed because the right-of-way did location changing. That's I don't want to make that confusing. But anyway, so that alternatives analysis process we believed happened with the subdivision, and so then the given is that cross section I showed you, and just to make it clear that to put a street like that essentially right at the tree, and a street like that has to go is excavated 24 to maybe 30 inches in order to build that street. And Keith could correct me if I'm wrong. So to excavate 30 inches or so right next to a couple of major oak trees, that really is something that we consider as part of the land use process. So I apologize if we could have kind of revisited all those same issues as part of this process here, but to us that was just a given because the council already haven't given us that direction.
Thank you for that. And Tom, I know you're able to chime in a little bit more on Keith's question.
Sure. I wanted to respond to the notion that, we can't issue a permit because a tree has already been cut down. The question really before SPRAB is, could a permit have been issued? And, given the circumstance of the tree, was this a tree that, at the end of the day, a permit would have been properly issued for? And did the tree at the time it existed, did it meet the criteria for being cut down? That's the question that's being asked of SPRAB, given that the tree is already cut down. The other thing that I want to make sure doesn't get lost in this is that, all the alternatives, all the speculation about what the street could have been or should be, or any of those things are correctly the purview of the land use process. And it's not SPRAB's purview to redesign the street. It's presented with a street design that has been approved, and they need to accept that as a given. There was some discussion about, well, gee, why is it this way? Well, in part, you need to think about it like this. There's a hierarchy of decision makers in this process. There's the Planning Commission, there's the City Council, and then there's, ultimately LUBA. And so, obviously the City Council, for purposes of the city, is the ultimate decider in this circumstance. And so it's incongruous to suggest that, SPRAB would be able to undo a decision that was made by the duly elected board. And so that's the reason why staff has recommended that, we're here for the design that was approved through that process, that was, in fact, appealed from City Council to LUBA, and ultimately that decision was made. There's been lots and lots of process and lots of compromise that was made through the land use process. The street design is now static, and it's that design that SPRAB has to consider in light of the permit application.
So Tom, I just want to clarify one thing, and I see we have a couple others, but looking at 86090, it says the permit due to the director may permit the removal of a city tree due to construction if there is no reasonable alternative. So I completely understand what you're saying, that we are not in the business of designing alternatives, but isn't it then within our purview to say whether or not there, or at least a reasonable alternative was discussed or considered to make the permit worthwhile?
At what point?
I mean, at this point, it would be whether or not the tree removal was worthwhile or was warranted, correct? I mean, that is how I read that, is that I agree that we're not saying what the alternative should be, but just under the code, the permit is pertinent on the idea that there is no reasonable alternative. So that's where that does seem pertinent to this discussion.
Right. In the context of the existing land use decision, which has already set the design and the layout of the street.
And I think staff's position is that the trees are then in the way of this approved design for the street. So there's in our the way we've presented it to the SPRAB board, that is it is kind of a given, and that it speaks really to a problem in our process, because it really is late in the process. So I can see why, as I described earlier, that that this is the sequence of events, let alone even if the trees had not been removed, the sequence of events is something that we really would like to reconsider for future applications.
Woody, do you have a question?
Yeah, first I want to clarify when I talk about saving trees, I was specifically talking about these particular trees as they looked on the plan, that there was pretty much, when you're talking about well, you said that we're not in a job or whatever of looking for alternatives. That's just not what part we play. But anyway, my concern is just, I'm about setting a precedent here. I'm worried about if this happens again, what's going to be the deterrent of whatever of this happening again? Of us not knowing what the city manager or whoever's whatever fines or whatever else are levied, that we're not going to know until after the fact. And this, it's just, I'm just worried that it might be just pretty easy for another contractor to just do this on purpose and ask for forgiveness and pay a fine rather than actually go through the process they should go through.
Well, I think Glenn could maybe speak to the idea of that, the decision to cut down these trees without a permit is also going to lead to some additional process as part of the land use decision. And so, there's a built-in disincentive to not follow the rules. They're going to have to go back. They're going to have to get an amendment, perhaps, of their land use decision. They're going to have to get an amendment of their tree conservation plan. And all that stuff costs money, and it costs time, and it costs staff. So there really is a disincentive just from a practical standpoint to not do this again. And so, but Glenn I think can amplify that idea, I think, further.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I don't want to necessarily speak too much for the applicant, but most developers in this situation would have rather paid a fine of any amount and been done with the process. And so this process is not something that the developer would have preferred. So that if there's an impression that somehow there's some sort of a preference or a benefit to that, that's quite the opposite. This is actually something that is a negative to the developer, and it demonstrates to them that they didn't avoid the process by violating the rule. So that I hope that's clear that this is the motivation for this is to make sure this doesn't happen, and that's really staff's goal as well. So hope that helps.
Just to clarify one process question you just said there. So it will go back for an amendment at the Land Use Commission regardless of what the decision is today. Is that correct? That is part of the process now?
I'm not sure that's a guarantee. I think that is unknown until this decision is rendered. Tom, would you disagree with that?
I think that if the permit is denied, then I think there will necessarily have to be an amendment process. At least that's my understanding from talking to planning staff. And because of the changes in the designation of the trees as some being street trees and some being not street trees, there will also have to be an amendment of the tree conservation plan, is my understanding. And so that's the best answer I can give.
Yes, I agree. The tree conservation plan definitely will need to be revised. I don't know about that condition 8 yet.
Okay. Mickey, I saw you had your hand up. I saw it this time.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I kind of actually have a question for Tom, because Tom, you keep saying that whether the permit gets denied or not, these things might occur or whatever. But my question for you is, according to our SPRAB bylaws, under the appeal procedures, in the paragraph before the last one, it says that the appeal may be approved, conditionally approved, or denied on the basis of conformity with the code and administrative rules. So I guess my question is, are we going to be making a decision on the appeal or on the permit?
Well, I mean, they're one and the same.
Well, no, I don't agree.
Well, that's your purview. My legal opinion is that they're one and the same. What you're being asked to do is determine whether the permit was correctly issued by the director. And so, and that's come before you because of an appeal. So you're either going to affirm the appeal and deny the permit, or you're going to affirm the permit and deny the appeal. They're two halves of the same question.
Well, let me explain why I see them as different. Is the neighborhood association was not given this due process where they could, where the appeal could be considered and these alternatives could be considered in the first place. So to me, we would be saying, yeah, do they have a right to appeal this or not? I mean, that's the way I'm seeing it. It's more in terms of whether the appeal is valid or not.
Well, so I guess I have to disagree with your premise. There was lots of due process regarding the design of the street and the development. And they had lots of opportunity to comment on the trees and the alignment of the street. And in fact, the decision got appealed on 2 different occasions, first to the city council and then to LUBA. And after all of that process, after all of the appeals and all the hearings and all the negotiations between staff, this is the plan that came about. And so there's been lots and lots of due process in this case. And everyone, you know, the neighborhood association and all the neighbors have had an opportunity, ample opportunity, to talk about how this street got designed and whether they agreed with it or not. And then decisions were rendered by the decision makers in those circumstances. First at the Planning Commission, then at the City Council, and then there was an appeal that was ultimately settled by LUBA.
But they can't appeal a tree removal until the permit's been issued.
That's right.
You have a question?
Yeah, well, I think that was going to be, I think we got to my question, and that's why I'm rethinking it a bit. But the idea that they had process before and that they had due process and there was this procedure before that could be engaged with had nothing to do with the tree permit, removal permit, which has its own defined process in the city code. And that process has been effectively ignored and abolished. And I understand that there's a element of muddiness around the land use planning procedures and code around that versus the tree removal. But the fact remains that the tree removal permit process is still in the city code and is still a process that has to be applied appropriately and has its own due process elements as a part of it. And that, to me, has been blatantly ignored and rolled over here.
Right. Yeah. All I can say is that what was going to happen with the trees was extensively discussed, and Glenn was much more conversant with the land use process in this case. But my understanding is that, you know, what was going to happen with the trees and the alignment of the street and these things were discussed at length. And it's incongruous to suppose that after all of that process, after the duly elected officials within the city have approved this design and process, that SPRAB could come along and require the redesign of the street. And so
I don't think we are requiring that. We're requiring an appropriate permit process for tree removal, which has also been put in place and enacted by the duly elected members of the city.
That's right. And so the question is, could they have gotten a permit based on these trees? And if they couldn't have gotten a permit, then they're going to suffer the sanctions that go along with that.
I don't think I agree that that's what the question is. I think the question is the permit that was issued correctly by the director? It's not a matter of if they had applied for the permit at the appropriate time, would it have been approved and would that have been appropriate? It's the question is the permit that has currently been issued, was that particular permit issued correctly?
We're not interpreting it that way. And so, but you're the decision maker. And if you want to make the decision the way that you're describing, that's within your purview. But the advice that we're giving as legal counsel is that if they were entitled, if there were no reasonable alternatives based on the land use decision, and they would have gotten a permit based on that land use decision and the fact that there were no reasonable alternatives, then the permit should issue and they'll be sanctioned appropriately in that circumstance.
I was muted. Tony Cato had his hand up, then Paul, and then Alan.
Yeah, Keith addressed some of the issues, some of the questions I was having, but maybe this is a Glenn question, I'm not quite sure, but if, in your own opinion, I guess, had the director, had the tree permit been issued appropriately at the right time, do you believe that the decision from the director would have been different or the same?
We believe as staff, it's unquestionable to us that you really cannot build the street as approved by council without removing the trees. So the trees cannot exist with that design of street.
As per the council approved at the time design.
Yeah, and so in the idea that the criteria being construction, does construction necessitate the removal of the trees? The simple answer would be yes, the construction necessitates the tree removal. So that's the basis, whether or not the trees have been removed. So now the nuance that we had not really brought to the SPRAB is should the permit have been issued in the first place? We've been focusing on does it meet the criteria.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, what's making me more and more uncomfortable about this is the fact that we're being put into position of approving a tree removal permit where really all the decisions around that permit have already been made by other people. It seems like this appeal process of holding these appeals, I mean, if we were going to have giving meaningful input into this, it seems like it would have been much further down the line, but I don't think we want to be put into position of reviewing all these development projects that affect all the street trees, where our position here is just the appeal process, but the process has already happened, and especially so in this case because the trees are gone. And if going with Tom's argument, the city council has approved this design. This design requires these trees to be removed, and the neighborhood association may rightly appeal because they don't like the way the design of the subdivision is going, affecting their neighborhood. But as that's been pointed out, that appeal has happened before. So, you know, I'm just uncomfortable that we're being put in a position of holding an appeal, running an appeal process on something that we have really no say-so in, even though technically we do, because we're the appeal board for this, but the process has already been completed. So anyway, it's just sort of my feelings about the whole thing. So I'm just uncomfortable feeling like we have to make any kind of decision on this.
I want to quickly point out procedurally, we still do have closing comments from the appellant and the applicant, and we will still have a chance to ask staff more questions, but I don't know if there's anyone else. Alan, you had your hand up, so I want to give you a chance to make any comments, but then we may want to move into the last couple presentations, so to speak, and then have our board deliberations where we can continue to ask questions of staff. Alan, you're on mute.
I have just a short question directed to our legal representative. and I think one of the problems in this whole process, and it's a sad process, because we've talked a lot of time and we can't change the outcome per se, but is that issuing after the fact permits, I would question that as a good management idea. If we hadn't done that, then courses would have taken their normal course of events, and this probably would have been solved. But I would question this after the fact thing. It's almost like robbing a bank and then making the person go back and open an account after the fact. I just think that's I think there's other ways to do with it administratively without issuing a permit, which really, since the trees are already gone, there's not much you can do with the permit. So anyway, that was my question. How does the legal community feel about these after the fact permits?
The legal community.
Let's put it this way: you as a legal representative, and I realize this not be a policy, but just I see this as an impediment to the process.
I understand the notion that if you were entitled to do something and you needed a permit to do it, and you started doing it without getting the permit first, that going back and getting the permit and having there be a sanction associated with that, that makes a certain amount of sense. It is certainly not the best way to regulate this. And, this hearing certainly points out that doing work this way doesn't inure to anyone's benefit. It certainly doesn't inure to the developer's benefit. It doesn't inure to the city's benefit trying to regulate this. The other thing I would point out is that had there not been a permit issued by the director, then this matter would have never come before SPRAB at all.
Exactly.
And you wouldn't have the opportunity to comment on it. You wouldn't have an opportunity to express your displeasure about what the developer did in this circumstance, nor would the other members of the community. So there is value in that process, and giving people an avenue to discuss, gee, this wasn't a great thing to do, to cut down the trees without a permit, and to let the developers who also have to operate in this community know that this is an unacceptable way of acting. And so there is that secondary value of this in this process, and we should note that as well.
Well, it seems that part of the issue is timing more so than the process. I mean, maybe I don't want to speak wrong. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Alan, but it seems like I don't know if anyone here is saying that the idea of having the appeals process is flawed. I think it's more having it done at the end when there's essentially a de facto saying that city council is going to, that approval supersedes what we might say here essentially.
Well, and Glenn is correct in that this particular circumstance probably wasn't contemplated by the code and by the people who drafted the code. What the tree code is really geared toward is this idea of somebody, who hasn't gone through any land use process, who cuts down a city tree. Some adjacent landowner who has a tree next to his city tree next to his house and cuts it down without a permit. Or that person wants to cut down a tree that doesn't warrant being cut down. And so they apply for a permit and they don't meet the criteria. We had an appeal of a permit decision that was set, gosh, was it right before COVID, regarding the cherry trees on Commercial? And I mean, it was that process that the code really was contemplating, and not one where there's been this extensive public process that resulted in a design that resulted then in the necessity to further that design to cut down the trees.
And I will second that, had we not gone through this process, there would have been a civil penalty issued, SPRAB would have never seen it, and the developer would have gone on. And so that if that's the preference of the board, that's something that we would move toward as part of the code, contemplating this happening again. So at some point we'll need to figure out what we want it to be like and try to make the code fit that for next time.
Yeah, Mr. Chair. So Glenn, Tom, can you expound on that? So like the idea that the director issued the permit and he had the option to not issue the permit, right? And in that case, we would not have an appeal of the permit and this whole section of the code would no longer apply. So what, to your point, Glenn, if the permit hadn't been issued, civil penalties would have been applied, presumably. What's the goal of issuing the permit? And I think you alluded to it earlier in terms of a relationship with the developer, but can you just speak to kind of what the goal was with issuing a permit at this stage when, at least my reading of the code, you can't do that, right? As you said, there's no after the fact permit written in the code.
I mean, in staff's reading of code and in the way we've administered codes for years, the two principles, which I kind of mentioned before, one of them is the developer needs to go through the process and don't avoid the process by doing something unlawful. So that's one principle that we thought it's appropriate to go through the permit process. The second part of it is that there are civil penalties to be issued, and we could have, I think the code would have allowed for an interpretation to say, potentially, and Tom can correct me, he's the lawyer, that you issue a civil penalty and we're done. And there's nothing else to discuss. Then the issue then with that is the land use condition specifies that there needs to be a tree removal permit. And so then we go back through the land use process to fix it. And so we really believe that the of all the different approaches and the way the code was written, we thought this really met the intent the best of all those different angles. So I hope that helps explain.
Yeah, so essentially, if I may kind of summarize that, what you're saying is that from your reading, a tree removal permit is required for this to move forward, whether or not, and so the idea of the developer ignoring the tree removal permit, simply issuing a fine for that, does not provide them that permit, and therefore the development does not move forward.
I mean, yeah, and so if SPRAB, for example, I think if SPRAB were to say that the director was incorrect in issuing a permit, then the director would move directly to a civil penalty. And then the land use process would then need to amend whatever it needs to amend to make sure that those conditions are met appropriately. And I don't want to speak for, that's a discretionary process. I don't want to speak for how to play out.
But you're saying, yes, so it would disrupt the whole, okay. I got it.
Yeah, keeping an eye on time here. I do want to recognize, I appreciate everyone being here so late. If the board's okay with it, I suggest we have our final comments by the appellant and the applicant and then continue in the deliberation on the board. Unless there's anything final that, okay. Let's, then we will now move to the appellant. You get maximum of 7 minutes, but shorter is always appreciated at this point. And you're on mute, Ted.
Hello, thank you again for the superpowers. I am going to try to make this brief, but I'm new to the process, but I have to respectfully disagree with council here on this one. Our issue on due process was totally ignored when it comes to the illegal removal of the trees. The trees were cut down before a notice of removal was posted. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. We had no way to appeal the removal of these trees before they were cut down. Due process totally ignored. So I want to point out one other thing too, that it was a tentative approval on the tentative plan. The plan sheets I have from the Wren Heights subdivision are tentative. They're not firmed up. So council approved tentative plans. Condition 8 is very, 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 very specific. prior to issuance of public construction permits, you must obtain final approval for tree removal permits. Staff went out of their way and sent an application to the developer and reminded them, you've got to do this. They totally ignored it. Then, prior to this hearing, we were told due process was not a part of this process. We're good with that. We were told reasonable alternatives were the subject matter here. We think we have shown that there were reasonable alternatives. Reasonable alternatives did exist, but there seems to be a closed loop on this reasonable alternative thing. The plans say we got to do it this way. What were the reasonable alternatives? There are none listed. We have a guideline, and we think that we have to try and look for these reasonable alternatives simply because these were white oaks. These are significant trees, folks. These were not saplings. And prior to removal of these, as in the admin rule 109-500-2.4, the rule establishes that alternatives must be examined to include redesign of the project. Okay. Use of alternative construction practices. Okay. Use of alternative materials. What about permeable paving? We haven't even gotten into that for the sake of time. We could have reduced the flood retention square footage by implementing permeable paving. Alternative locations for the work are also required to be looked at by this admin rule. And finally, the admin rule says, and look at other methods to meet the goals of the project. What were the other methods? We've suggested several. Our favorite is a little simple realignment. I know if you're an engineer, and Glenn, I totally respect you. I worked for ODOT for like 32 years. So that's out of the bag right there. And alternatives were in our daily kit. If you drew something, you designed something, you thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, somebody would say, we got a problem here. And we'd look at it, we'd find an alternative. And many of you've heard of this, the tram project up at OHSU. It was on hold. There were big problems because people did not want trams going over their backyards. What could we do? We drew the plans. We're ready to rock and roll. We've got a 35-foot easement. What else could we do? Well, kind of like the kid who looks at the tires at the stuck truck and says, don't take the truck apart. Don't knock the bridge deck down. Let the air out of the tires. Someone said, let's put up some film on the tram cars so you can't look down in people's backyards. We weren't looking for that alternative. We were looking for everything else in the world. That was pretty cool. And you have to really appreciate people who bring alternatives to you. Fred Miller, former director of ODOT, had a cocktail napkin on his coffee table. It said ODOT plan and a price tag. The stamp that said approved was on the cocktail napkin. It said citizens plan adopted, and the price tag was about a third. So anyhow, I think alternatives need to be examined. We don't think they were examined because we haven't seen any of them. And I totally appreciate the conundrum you guys are in, that we cannot go forward in this city with developers saying, I made a mistake. It's a problem. Because if it happens here, you're setting precedent that they're getting away with it again. So really, I truly applaud what you're doing because I know most of you are volunteers. And I know some of my cohorts would like some of my time. And I'm totally inept here on my ancient abacus. And I wasn't able to send a nice chat back to Tony. But Tony, thanks for telling me I'd have 7 minutes here. And I believe Ron Ekus would like some time as well, if possible. Or you have questions for me, I'm good with that.
We really only had time allotted for you at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, we've closed the public comment at this point.
I just really think that the designers had gone out, and I know some have walked the area, but really looked at the character of the street and been in attendance at the meetings that asked to retain the character of the street. And we were told the character of the street would be retained. And the fact that also in one of our meetings, there was tremendous confusion on the tree removal process. We were told at that time, alternatives could be brought to the table, but the trees were taken down. And I don't think in big league development, you have room for error. So not like this. They made a surveying error. They don't know where the survey line is. They had to go back and correct it. And we think this is going to become a road to nowhere. So, or a bike lane to nowhere, or a sidewalk to nowhere. So there has to be a way around it. And the developer did work with the one person who took him to Luba. I don't know what their resolution was, but they came to some resolution. Perhaps there should be resolution here in terms of saying this permit should not be affirmed. And we would like our $283 back. So thank you for your time. I'll let you go. I don't have much more than that. But I think we've made a good case that there are reasonable alternatives. Or
Thank you so much.
been examined.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Totally appreciate you guys and Mickey gals too. I can only see a few faces.
Next, we are going to hear from Keith as the applicant for your final comments. If you're talking, Keith, you're on mute. Possible that we lost him. I'll look in the chat section here.
I think he's there now. No, he's not.
I see Mark Ferris in the list, which I know was his name previously. Last chance.
Gonna try and send him a message here.
Hello?
Hello, there you are. Hello,
Oh,
Keith.
good. Sorry for the confusion. I just want to touch on 4 quick items. First of all, I guess I'm bothered by the insinuation there was a surveying error. There was not a surveying error. There was a different resolution of the boundary that was approved by the city surveyor and approved and recorded by the county surveyor. So the boundary line as it is now established has been accepted by public entities and signed by me, the project surveyor. The second thing that I want to mention is I really am sorry that my comments about Jim Krozik's presence came off as trying to use Jim as a scapegoat. My intent was to make it clear that the developer wasn't trying to hide anything. The applicant wasn't trying to hide anything when he was doing this. He thought it was okay. And he stood by Jim and talked to him while it was going on. That was my intent in those comments. And I apologize for if there was any miscommunication with regard to that. With regard to the alternates, one of the very first alternates that we proposed was to just have 2 travel lanes. And it was the city traffic engineer that said, we have to have the bike lane. And part of our job as the engineer for the applicant is to try and minimize the applicant's cost. And by removing all that asphalt, removing the earthwork, removing the base rock that was required there, I'm not even talking anymore. Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, excellent. Okay, thank you. Removing all that would have been a great thing for the developer, and all those trees could have been saved. But we were told by city staff, we have to have the bike lane. So we provided the bike lane. And the depth of construction is an excellent point. You know, I think it was board member Dukes, is it, that suggested, you know, we don't want to avoid trees thinking we're saving them and then later on they die. Well, it's a pretty widely accepted rule of thumb that you have to stay outside the canopy of a tree in order to keep from damaging the tree from excavation and from compaction. And the city engineer is not going to allow us to build a substandard section by those trees, because down the road, then the city would have a maintenance problem. And I fully understand that. All these things come together where if the focus at one time, which is now, is on those two trees, then everybody loses sight of all the work that went into the alternatives analysis and all the competing requirements from the traffic engineer, the city engineer, the functional classification of the roadway, and the city's transportation system plan. So I guess I would ask that the board consider all those elements, recognize that we went through a significant alternatives analysis to try and save the trees that could actually live, and the ones we couldn't assure would be saved had to come out. And it was just 14% of the trees that were involved in this were all that had to come out. We saved 86% of the trees. And I would hope that everybody would consider the effort that went into it and affirm the permit, because the council has already acted on approving the street section, and there was a lot of input and a lot of discussion regarding the trees during that land use process. And that concludes my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before we move into board deliberations, are there any more questions of staff that the board would like to ask?
I don't know why I went away.
Is everyone comfortable moving into board deliberations at this point?
Yes.
Okay. Then we will declare the public portion of this meeting closed in terms of public comment and we will deliberate amongst ourselves. We've had quite a lengthy double header today. Appreciate everyone. I know this is a challenging case. We have quite a situation with trees being removed. I understand the precedent concerns. I think we do need to consider the role of alternatives. We also need to consider the role of would the permit have been approved had this been, if the application had been at the correct time. Before I cloud anything too much, I would just be very open to what others think.
Well, I guess one of the things that concerns me the most is throughout this entire process, it's unfortunate it came in at this level. It sort of erodes the trust of the public involving the city, and it certainly doesn't cast the developer in any great light. It's just unfortunate that it's come to this, but I think, I think, or at least I think I fully understand where our responsibility lies, both in what we can do and where the limits are in what we can do. So that said, I just wish things, this could have turned in so many different directions and we probably wouldn't be here tonight. But it's just unfortunate that, as I said, there's an old adage from a Southern politician that it's not only got to be right, it's got to look right. And I'm not too sure we've accomplished that as this process has unfolded.
I think that's accurate. Dave, were you going to say something?
No, I didn't have anything to say.
Sorry, I noticed you went off mute, so I wanted to make sure. Keith, you went off mute. Were you going to say something?
I think so. I think I'm kind of curious as to the board members' perspectives on what the question is, and I think because from where I'm at, I think to Alan's point, where we're at in this process, it's a mess, right? And I think where I'm at is if this permit had been applied for before the trees were cut and had been approved and appropriately followed through the process, my guess is the appeals probably would have been issued, but the permit would have been upheld and it would have moved forward. So from my perspective, kind of how the city has presented it, that would suggest that we should uphold, that perspective would suggest we should uphold it, right? They're arguing that if the permit would have been approved and the trees met the conditions for removal, then it should be approved now. And I think the other side of that question where I feel like I'm leaning toward is that's not the question. And the question is more about the director's approval of this permit and these conditions. And the conditions that are there are the trees were already removed. And so it comes down to the process aspect of it and the removal of due process and the lack of following of both the city code and the land use planning process that was put in place and requiring the permit. So I guess I'm interested in perspectives from other board members on which of those questions we feel like we're trying to answer. Is it questions on the validity of the permit had it been appropriately acquired months ago, or is it on the validity of the director's issuing of the permit when the director did?
It's a good question. I think one thing I would just add as we think about it is just food for thought more than an opinion, but the reminder that there will be some penalties regardless. And so in this case, I guess we have to think too, what is the situation of possible remedies if this does happen again in the future? And so noting that the fact that several processes were followed, and if someone did not follow the process, but then is penalized for that incorrect activity, but then if the permit would have been approved, then it's not completely off the hook. I'm not, like I said, not trying to push one way or another, but I think it's important to remember that aspect of it. Like Tom was saying, that it's more of someone that was halfway through or 3/4 of the way through a process versus someone that just went out and cut down a tree. So there's a level of, at least, and there had been other appeals. And so there's been some process that's gone through. And so I think that does play a factor in this, but Tony, I see you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah. As you were talking, Keith, and as I was thinking about what Ted had said in his closing comments, I was thinking about, were there opportunities for citizen input that were lost because the application process happened in the time that it did after the fact? And Ted was kind of saying that. It seems like that's true, that some of the alternatives that he kind of presented today could, whether they would have had those available or not, I don't know, but could have been presented at an earlier time in the process, possibly, I don't know, before council approval, if the process had been followed. So it's about citizen input and allowing all the opportunities that should have been available for citizen input to be available.
I think that's a really good point. Woody.
Yeah, I appreciate what Alan said about trust, and that's the issue I'm having and setting precedent. But I also hear what they're saying about if having approved a permit actually gets it in the process, and it's already, all of this is already beyond where we're at now anyway. Those decisions have already been made. But there needs to be something in the motion. I think that a follow-up of asking council or I don't know where to go exactly, but to follow up on this so that it doesn't just drop through the cracks and not knowing what's going to happen the next time. It needs to be followed up on and addressed, and what changes we could make to fix these problems so that we don't run into this again.
Just a note on that too. I had a conversation with Tom before all this, just to get a sense of how our motions could be framed and what some of the opportunities were in terms of SPRAB. And two that I think are particularly relevant. One is in our motion is that we can, while we cannot dictate code enforcement, we can at least make a recommendation that there should be code enforcement be sanctioned in a proportional manner to the code and make sure that's not lost. And another thing that we could do is we as SPRAB can make a motion expressing our dissatisfaction with this process and with the developer specifically in this case. And while that's not a legally binding motion, it's at least a statement of the board that could then be written and adopted at the next meeting to have some form of that on record for what happened. So once again, just want to put that out there as an option as we're considering everything on the table. Yeah, Mickey.
I just wanted to ask, so what you're saying is we're looking at potentially 2 motions here.
In theory, that is my understanding, is that those could be separate motions if we wanted to do that, where there could be one to affirm the permit, and then another to express our dissatisfaction with the process in terms of how it was carried out. And once again, just showing that out there as an option because it wasn't something I had really considered prior to that conversation. So I want to make sure everyone else is aware of that as well. Yeah.
So do we have to have a motion that says that we want to consider both of them separately?
I think we could make separate motions for both of them. So one motion would be for the permit, and then one motion would then be for a statement of dissatisfaction from SPRAB. That's my understanding. But I'm curious in terms of the permit itself. I think Keith's question is still on the table a little bit in terms of what we're considering, whether it's would the permit have been issued, or is it the fact that there was no tree and no public process around the permit that makes it inaccurate?
Yeah, I believe the permits would have been issued.
But Woody, is that the question that we're answering now?
No, I don't know. I thought that was
In terms of the motion, in terms of the motion we're making, is our motion going to be made on the basis on whether or not the permits would have been issued?
That's how I look at it. I don't see any way that would have been denied. If they would have been denied.
My interpretation from what was presented was that if the motion that we are helping dictate in this case what level of penalty is assessed for the wrong, which does not take away from the fact that it was a wrongful removal. And so in this situation, it's either if the permit was valid, then it's a different penalty for the fact that they did not get the permit. And so that's a waiting period, versus if the permit would not have been issued in the first place, then it's an even more serious violation because then they cut them down without having any approval whatsoever. That was how I understood it to be presented.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think, frankly, the violation doesn't have, I don't think, any consideration in terms of the penalty payment required, right? That's not our particular purview, and I don't think it gets to the idea of the process involved. It's a consequence of our vote, perhaps, but I don't know that it's a consideration of our vote in terms of recognizing in terms of the appeal on the director's issuance of the permit.
Yeah, if the permit was timely, of course there wouldn't be any penalty.
For the sake of discussion, I would make a motion that, as unpleasant as it may sound, that we affirm the decision by the director in issuing the permit, just primarily for the reason of discussion.
Do we have a second for that motion?
Second.
Woody, okay, Woody seconds. So now let's discuss the motion at hand. We have a motion to affirm the director's permit.
The reason I made it, and as I said, I do it, and I find it unpleasant to be making this motion, but I'm a realist. And one, we can't bring the trees back. We've uncovered a lot of shortcomings in this process. I'm hoping that the developer will learn from this and not take this course of action. And I take exception to the gentleman, for the developer, that said that he thought everything was okay. Somebody knew those permits hadn't been issued. And that's a fact. That's a fact of life. But being a realist, that the project's going to go forward. The trees we can't replace them. The best thing we can do is make the best of a bad situation and move on. Learn from our mistakes, and I hope that everybody involved, the city as well as the developer, will learn from some of this process. And as I said, the biggest casualty is people lose trust in the city staff and city government because they don't feel like that they were heard throughout the process. And these after the fact permits don't do anything to assuage that concern.
Paul?
Yeah, and the fact that really within the department, there's been sort of precedent of issuing after the fact permits, and I think the same feeling comes down to, well, you send out a message to the public that, well, you can just go ahead and do it, and we'll get you a permit later. But I agree, we're way too far along in the process. The way the subdivision was approved through all the appropriate channels, those trees had to be removed. And the fact that, and there will be penalties on the developer, it may have already slowed down the development of the subdivision, I don't know. But yeah, so I would concur with that motion. Not comfortable, but concur.
Yeah, Dave.
Well, I want to recognize that the developer did go through a process with the subdivision approval and did save more trees on that property than they needed to meet the requirements. So they actually did preserve more trees than they would have had to have done. I don't like the fact that the trees were cut down and now we're dealing with this after the fact. If nothing else, it would have given an appeal with the trees still standing, would at least given us in the community around that neighborhood a time to grieve the loss of those trees, where now they're gone and it kind of a shock, where they didn't really understand why the trees were going.
I think that's a good point in recognizing. I think it's good to find some of the positives, and I wholeheartedly agree with Alan's comment that somebody knew that this permit was required. We have record that it was issued, but at the same time, having someone from Public Works on site that was telling them that most things were good, I can see how you can see how there's a situation where there's confusion that can be created from that. And obviously that's another system that should probably be looked at in terms of how this communication is going on from the city level in terms of trust and whatnot. But yeah, Mickey.
I know everyone's going, oh no. Well, I wanted to second the thought that I really appreciate the savings of the trees in the tree conservation permit thing, because we do need to move forward toward our tree canopy goal and not away from it. So I really do appreciate that. My concern is still with the motion and us voting to affirm the decision of the director, when to me, it is still whether or not this appeal of the director's decision is approved or valid. Because if we say that a permit exists, then basically that whole land use plan can go through without any further changes because all the conditions would have been met, right? I mean, that's the way I'm trying to resolve and understand this.
I think they would still have to, it sounds like they still have to get an amendment on their land use plan for the fact that the trees two of them are no longer on public property is what I believe Glenn was implying. But I don't think, but you're right. And this process, I think it would just then be civil penalty or not civil penalties, it would be penalties associated with it if the permit was approved, and then it would be able to move forward.
Just a thought on the after the fact permits, right? I mean, I think as Paul said, those seem to be commonplace in other aspects of building code and development. And I think I see this as a little bit different because it's completely irreversible, as opposed to some of those other permits that might be issued after the fact. The other thing is just thinking about other city codes and city requirements, right? You can't pay your parking meter after the fact. You're cited for that, and it's not a error that can be remedied in just by paying the parking meter that you should have paid, right? I mean, that there's a ticket with that and a fine associated with that. So it's just again, I think if I like the idea of moving forward and finding, and I don't know that there's a way to remedy the errors that have been done, right? But I think the idea of affirming the permit, in my mind, kind of affirms the process, right? And affirms the idea that a permit was issued for trees that do not exist. And I just don't see how that fits in with the city code that we are being called to uphold.
I think the one clarification I would just offer in terms of the parking permit analogy is that there will still be a penalty for not having, for X number of days, for not having received the permit. But yeah, just in terms of the process. But I also agree with the fact that it sounds like this would be the very first retroactive tree permit. And so like you mentioned with electricity or electricians and whatnot, that's reversible, whereas this would be creating a precedent for a tree permit, and it sounds like the first time. But Woody, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah. I forgot where I was going to go. I'm sorry. Give me a minute.
Other comments while Woody is rethinking?
Yeah, I guess like Alan said, it's hard to swallow this, and it's kind of like who's going to blink first? Us. I mean, we're showing good faith in a way about going ahead and approving it, because they said that we wouldn't have gotten this if it wasn't approved to start with. So I'm not sure. It's a trust issue and setting the precedent. Those two things still just drive me crazy. But getting back to what I told Keith, that I believe that permits would have been approved goes a long ways with that. I'm not happy.
Yeah, Tony.
Yeah, I think there's merit to reversing, possibly, as Nikki was saying, reversing the actual motion. Well, I don't know off the top of my head how this has been framed in the past with appeals. But you think about the judicial process, it's an appeal, and that's what we're reacting to. That's what we're weighing in on, more so than the original decision. So maybe that makes more sense to frame it in that direction, in that way.
Well, I believe it's the appeal of decisions. So are we? My interpretation of that is that we're making a choice. Our decision is based on the decision of the director, less so the appeal, because they have standing, and we know that. But I believe it's really about the validity of the appeal. The appeal is where our jurisdiction lies, or of the permit being addressed. Sorry, I missaid that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, that's okay. I just wanted to say, so what you're saying then, Dylan, is does not follow the guidelines in our bylaws.
How so?
Because as I mentioned, our bylaws say that we are supposed to approve, conditionally approve, or deny the appeal.
Actually, it is the appeal that brought it to it. It wasn't a permit that got this to us. It was the appeal, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking about what Tom said, and but you're right. I think it's the appeal that got us here.
So the appeal is the fact that those trees were removed. It's not a matter, the appeal is not whether there was a valid permit or not, because technically there was a valid permit because it was issued by Public Works. So that was in standing. Now, we may say it was after the fact and so forth, but if the appeal is on the fact that those trees shouldn't have been removed, but everything else that we've been presented says we would have had no choice but to say it's okay to remove those trees.
I'm reviewing some of the documents, Nikki, and I think you do make a good point about some of the wording inconsistencies, because some of the procedures talk more about the decision, but whereas you're right about the bylaws talking more about the appeal.
In other words, if we, which may, probably, and I was incorrect, my motion should have said that we deny the appeal and uphold the decision on the part of the director in awarding the permit.
There's that conversation with Tom about chicken or egg kind of a thing, isn't it? Because he's talking about the appeal and the permit, both were kind of one and the same kind of a thing. They're interconnected kind of strangely or whatever. That's quite a conundrum.
Mickey, yes.
Can we amend the motion? I liked Alan's suggestion. I don't remember exactly what it was word for word, but I would like to move that we amend the motion based on what he just said.
What I was saying, and I appreciate the clarification that other board members provide. We're addressing the appeal. The appeal is on the part of the applicant, the neighborhood association. If we deny that appeal, we automatically uphold the decision by the director, from what I understand. We may not like it, but that's what would happen.
We would affirm the decision by the director, correct?
That's right, by denying the appeal of the neighborhood association.
Correct.
Chair?
Yes, Tom.
Just as a parliamentary matter, Mickey has correctly suggested the process that you could go through. There could be a motion to amend the original motion. That motion, a motion to amend would have to be seconded and then voted on. And then if passed, then you would vote on the amended motion. That would be the process, given where you are having a motion that has been seconded.
Thank you for that, Tom. So Mickey, yes, would you like to restate your substitute motion or your amended motion?
Yes, amended or substitute, whatever you call it.
No,
yeah.
It should be amended.
It would be amended, yeah.
Substituted is a whole other thing.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, I move that we deny the appeal and affirm the decision of the director on the tree removal permit.
Just to clarify, you're moving to amend the original motion to read the way that you just spoke, you just enunciated?
That is correct.
Okay.
Do we have a second for the amended motion?
I'll second.
All right, Dave seconds. So the motion that's before us right now is to deny the appeal and affirm the director's decision.
No, the motion that's before you right now is the motion to amend. So
Okay.
you have to decide to amend the original motion. It would be the vote first.
Okay. Well, any discussion before we vote to amend the motion? Okay, we'll do a roll call now. Mickey?
Yes, on the amendment.
Okay. Alan?
Yes on the amendment.
Tony?
Aye.
Woody?
Yes.
David?
Yes.
Keith?
Yes on the amendment.
Paul?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. All right, so we have an amended motion on the table. Is there any further discussion about the amended motion that we currently have before us to deny the appeal and affirm the director's decision?
And just so that we're clear, it would probably make sense to reiterate what the motion is that you're voting on.
Okay, to deny the appeal and reaffirm the director's decision to issue the tree removal permit.
Mr. Chair, should we specify which tree removal permit in that motion?
Sure.
We all know what we're talking about here, but if we specify, I don't remember how the city labeled it, but.
So we will be, so it would be denying the appeal and affirming the decision for the tree removal permit at the 500 block of Salem Heights Road.
Yeah.
Any further discussion on this motion?
Tom, should we offer that as a friendly amendment to the amended motion?
It's clear, but
okay.
We can.
If you're happy, I'm happy.
Yeah, we can deal with it in the.
I think that's just, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom, for the parliamentary help there. I appreciate that.
Oh, I know it was welcome.
Okay, let us vote on the motion that's before us then. I will roll call. Mickey.
Oh, I got on mute. No.
Alan.
Yes.
Tony.
No.
Okay, I should probably keep track of this. Woody. Sorry, Woody, did you say?
No, it's hard. Yes.
Dave.
Yes.
Keith.
No.
Paul.
Yes.
And this is a hard one. As written, I will vote yes. So the motion carries 5-3. That being said, I'm open if people want to discuss a secondary motion as we talked about that would then have expressing our displeasure with the process and where we're at.
I like to get business done and get it over with, but considering the lateness of the hour and how fatigued we are with all this, would it be better for us to exchange ideas this next month and put that motion on next month's agenda, or the possible motion on next month's agenda?
That is a good question from a parliamentary procedure. If we can do that, I'm not sure. I don't think that we can float a motion to the next meeting.
Well, so the appeal has been decided. And
Yes.
so if, this next motion would be an advisory opinion by the board. It could be carried to next month if you want to, because you've completed the task that your statutorily obligated task. If you want to express your displeasure about either the process or what the developer did, or anything like that, that could go until next month. So yes, it's okay to do it. Whether it's a good idea or not is again up to the board.
We also decide about who we're going to send it to.
We send it to council.
Yeah, so it's right.
That would be my suggestion.
And maybe I suggest that part of that dissatisfaction that we express is part of wanting to address this process to make sure that this doesn't come to us as late as it did this time. So may I propose then that we discuss that next month at our meeting.
Well, perhaps we can have ongoing discussion throughout the month, and we'll be prepared perhaps to solidify something at our next meeting.
Mickey, I see you're shaking your head. Would you like to make a comment?
Well, we can't discuss it before the next meeting.
Yes, we can. It's our obligation is over for the appeal.
Well, we have to be careful about talking amongst ourselves outside of the meetings is what Mickey's referring to, because we can't have, anytime you reach a quorum or a chain meeting, then we're running into issues there. But what we could do instead perhaps is what if one of us or two of us collaborating through Tony proposed to draft something that could then be presented at the next meeting for us to comment on? Are there one or two people that would be willing to do that drafting?
I certainly would be happy to help.
Okay. Anyone else would be interested in helping Alan? I'm happy to, but I also did the last couple, so I'm happy to let someone else take a shot at working on those. Okay, Alan, I will work with you on that. Would you mind doing the first draft this time?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Would you mind writing the first draft of such a statement? And then if you send it to Tony and myself, then we can work on that and make sure we have something ready to present to the board next month. Okay, wow, this was a marathon meeting. This might be, I don't know about a record, but this seems like a long one. We have a new business section. Is there anyone that would like to raise new business for discussion? Hearing none, the next meeting is October 8th. I want to add a comment, or just for Tony Whitler, any final notes that we should know just in terms of technology, communication, anything from the city side? Tony, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was trying to get my video to go. At this time, no.
Okay. Well, with that, I just want to thank everyone. This was a really challenging set of hearings that we had, and there was a lot of good information presented. And so just, I know this was a long time for everyone to stick around. So thank you all so much. And this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan, for keeping control of the whole